So a big welcome to this half day of training on applying the nature-related financial disclosure standards of the TNFD. So this program is really a truly collaborative effort. It's driven by that demand that we're seeing for more support to implement the framework of the TNFD, more support to really help organizations to understand, manage their nature-related issues. So we'll get into more on all of that today. But firstly, just a big thanks to all of our partners on this program, to the TNFD, to UNDP, and to the German government's International Climate Initiative for their support as well. And of course, a big thank you to all of you for taking the time as participants to join us in the workshop today as well. So to get us started, I'm delighted to say that we were joined today by Candice Dott, who's the Director of Market Engagement at the TNFD. So big thank you, Candice, for being here with us to kick off the session, and I'll pass over to you.
Thanks so much, Fiona, and hello and welcome everyone to today's interactive global workshop on managing and reporting on nature. And really thank you to Fiona and Tiffany and Fiona from Global Canopy as well, who'll be joining you. You in for a treat. This is an amazing session. And I lead our global market engagement, as Fiona said. I look after that globally within the context as well of capacity building within the TNFD Secretariat. And it's amazing to see so many people from so many countries. I think there are well over 100 countries represented today. And I see a few people I've stayed up late in Latin America as well, because I was going to say largely people from Asia Pacific, Africa, and across Europe. It's really helpful to recognize such a diverse group of participants, firstly joining from business, finance, capital markets, and also representatives from governance, strategy, risk management, investor relations, reporting, sustainability, and finance functions and accounting functions. Because I think the diversity is exactly what is important here. Nature is not a topic that sits within a single department, and it's also increasingly becoming a strategic issue that affects decision making across all organizations and all job functions. This is the first of two global workshops. The second workshop is on the 9th of September, so just in case you have colleagues who are unable to attend today, I really encourage them to register for the next one as well. The reason this workshop matters is simple. Nature underpins our economies, our businesses, and our financial systems, yet nature loss and ecosystem degradation are creating growing challenges for organizations around the world. Businesses depend on nature for essential services such as water, soil health, pollination, climate regulation, and natural resources. But at the same time, business activities can have a significant impact on nature. So understanding these dependencies and impacts is now becoming essential to understanding risk, resilience, and long-term value creation. Investors, regulators, stock exchanges, and other stakeholders are increasingly seeking better information as well, and understanding how organizations are managing their nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. In response, the TNFD developed these recommendations that you're going to learn a lot more about today, and various guidance as well as the LEAP assessment tool to help assess, report, and act on these issues through a structured approach. But disclosure is not the end goal. The real objective is better decision making, and it's about helping organizations understand where they depend on nature, where they impact nature, and how those interactions may create risks and opportunities, and what actions can strengthen both business resilience and the resilience of the natural systems in which we all rely. So that's exactly what this workshop is designed to support. The objective over the course of the next few hours is to help you understand why nature is relevant to your organization, identify what resources are available, and how to help identify, manage, and assess those nature-related issues and who needs this information and why. So I really encourage all participants to approach this as a practical learning journey. You do not need to have all the answers today. The most important step is to start with understanding, building from what you already have, and engaging with the available guidance and tools, and take an iterative approach and use the little bit of time that you have to learn today. Thank you for joining us, and I really hope today's workshop is insightful, practical, and valuable as you begin or continue your organizational journey on managing and reporting on nature. Thanks. Back to you, Fiona.
Super. Thank you so much for that, Candice. I think that sets us off with some great context. And as you say, definitely going to be all issues we'll get into today as well. So thanks for setting that out so well, and to your team for all of your support on this program. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And so we're also very pleased that we have a second opening speaker joining us today from our other partner on this program, the UN Development Program, UNDP. So Maxim Vigacek is the UNDP's senior nature economist. So he leads the UNDP's engagement and projects that support nature positive development. So that's across all sorts of topics, including nature-related financial disclosures, debt instruments, and working with both the government and private sector on this topic. So a big thank you as well, Maxim, for joining us, and I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thank you, Fiona. And I'd like to return by thanking you, the partner on this series of training events, the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. And mention also that the whole series, as well as our work with TNFD on the nature-related disclosures, is supported by the government of Germany. And I won't dwell more, has been said well enough about the evidence that is coming through the window from the outside about what happens now to climate and nature, and the verdict that is, I think, is becoming ever more obvious for everybody, that as nature degrades, the cost of doing business is rising. And because stock exchanges sit at the heart of capital markets, the risks associated with ignoring nature, they quickly translate into instability, both at the micro level and at the macro level as well. It means lots to investors. It means lots to the confidence that investors have in the trajectories of development of specific businesses and sectors. Stock exchanges guide market standards, influence transparency. They shape how companies identify and manage and report risks, and that should include nature-related risks, and that should include nature-related opportunities. UNDP has been a co-founder and supporter of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures exactly for that reason. The recognition that comes with the nature value on the one hand, and the fact that when nature is ignored, that translates into instability for society. That is basically why UNDP is in the picture. Well, our partnership with the International Climate Initiative here enabled us to develop capacity building exercises and help TNFD develop the guidance that it has now published globally, and then build capacities specifically in developing countries. We have now been active in more than 15 developing countries. And we are partnering with UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative under this project, and we have been entering lots of these developing countries together with dedicated training sessions, which I'm very happy to say have been some of the most effective sessions so far. We are part of the advisory group on nature, which TNFD and UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative have. So all of this hopefully is building up the momentum that should reverse the kind of commonplace attitude to nature value and treating nature risks as such. We also understand that ISSB is pretty much watching the space and is doing its best in the current circumstance, in the current geopolitical context. There's been a recent announcement on nature standardization. We are hopeful that there's going to be more announcements from ISSB later this year. And within this background, just to wrap up and bring it back to why UNDP is in this, I'd like to say a few words about the relevance of developing countries. Yes, most of the investment comes from the global north. This is understood, but most of the businesses actually are sourcing services, products, and value chains are actually mostly rooted in the developing economies. These economies are most often most dependent on nature capital, and at the same time that they have most of the nature capital in the tropics and subtropics just by how our planet is organized. And at the same time, these are the countries which suffer the most in case the nature risks are ignored and nature opportunities are not tapped. So ensuring that capital markets in developing countries can recognize, disclose, and respond to nature-related risks for us is very important. That actually is why UNDP is in it. UNDP stands ready to continue our work with TNFD and UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges around the world to build the capacities and improve the guidance and to translate that into real ambitious work on nature. So today's workshop hopefully is part of that journey. Our aim here is simple: to equip you with the knowledge and tools, which then, together with your research institutes and investors at the jurisdictional level, you would be able to use and translate into concrete actions on the ground. So wishing all of us a productive session today, and back to you, Fiona.
Great. Thanks so much, Maxim. And we really appreciate all of your ongoing support and your team at UNDP. And do really recommend to all of our participants to check out the work that the UNDP team are leading on this topic, because there's lots of support and resources available across many geographies. And I know we have a big audience joining us from many countries today who may find these valuable. So big thanks again, Maxim. Excellent. So thanks for that, both Candice and Maxim. Great to have that context setting. So now to move into a little bit of a practical segment, I'll just talk us through how today's session will work before we get into the content itself. So firstly, you've probably noticed by now that as a participant, you're muted, but that isn't to say we don't really want your engagement in the session. So there's two main ways that you can interact in the session. So you can use the chat, as I see we've got many of you doing already, to share with us any general comments as we move through the session. We'll be also sharing lots of links to different resources there as we move through the training, so be sure to keep an eye out for those in the chat. However, as you can probably see already, the chat's going to be quite busy in a large session. So if you have a particular question for the team, it's really important to make sure you use the Q&A box for that question, because then we can directly answer your question and keep track of all of those there. So we do really encourage you to ask your questions, but make sure you're putting those into the Q&A box that you should also have available at the bottom toolbar of Zoom. Our format for today is a live 3.5-hour session. You should hopefully already be familiar with the fact that we had a 30-minute preparatory video that was available for you to watch on the webpage for this session in advance of the workshop. If you haven't already seen that video, we'll share that link with you so that you can watch that and catch up on some of the key concepts, but we'll be recapping that today as well. As I've already mentioned, we have that live opportunity to ask your questions throughout the session. We've got lots of specialists here today that I'll introduce to you shortly, ready to answer your questions. So please do make the most of that opportunity. We also really would like to see your participation in our workshop today. So we're going to be using a number of different exercises, including a tool called Mentimeter. We're going to share that link to Mentimeter a number of times with you in the chat so that you can join us there ahead of the exercises. So we really encourage you to take part in those. And thanks, Tiffany, who's just shared the link there. We'll keep sharing that with you a number of times, and we'll show a QR code option shortly for you to join us on screen. But you can already click that link that Tiffany has shared. And finally, for taking part in our workshop, you're also able to receive a completion certificate. We're going to send you that certificate after the workshop, but what you'll need to do in order to get your certificate is to fill out a feedback survey and quiz. And we're going to tell you more about that at the end of the session, but please keep an eye out for more at the end of the workshop about that. Another thing I think that's really helpful to mention up front is that we have all of the training materials from this session already available for you to download from the webpage for this workshop. We'll share that link also with you in the chat. Thanks, Tiffany. So it's the same page, but if you go to the bottom of that page, in the resources section, you'll be able to find the presentation from today as a PowerPoint handout. We'll also have the recording of the workshop there. You can find the model guidance on nature, which we're going to talk to you about as well, and also the materials for that Module 1 video. So make sure to check those resources out on the page. We'll also add the recording of today to that page after the session as well. So in terms of the goals for our training today, there's a few key things that we're hoping to help you cover. Firstly, that video that you would have watched in advance of joining the training today was really focused on helping you to understand why nature is relevant for your organizations and its importance for business. So encourage you to go back and watch that if you didn't already see it. Hopefully you've already got a bit of a baseline understanding from watching the video, and we're going to cover a little bit more on that in our live workshop today as well. And then in terms of the focus from our live workshop, there's 3 key things we're going to be talking about today. So we'd like you to be familiar with what resources are available to manage and disclose nature-related issues. We'd like to help you to understand how you can identify, assess, and manage nature-related issues. And finally, we'd like to think about who requires this information and help you to identify how you can best integrate the information that they need into your public disclosures. So to help us achieve those 4 objectives, we set out a 4-module structure that you'll see on the screen here. So module 1, as I mentioned, was included in that preparatory video. So we'll recap some of the key concepts today. And then we'll move through our remaining modules, which is all around aligning our approach. So setting the direction of our reporting and structures and using the TNFD framework and guidance to support us with that. In implement, we're really going to be thinking about how the practices and systems can be developed to help us to manage these issues. And then finally, in communicate, we'll work on the topic of reporting and engagement. And just to show you that in another format, this is our agenda for the session in terms of timings. You'll probably be pleased to see we do take a short 10-minute break in the middle of the session. So we'll do about half of the content, we'll take that short break, and then we'll move on. So we'll be following that 4-module structure I've mentioned there throughout. And then, as I've mentioned, I'm very pleased today to be joined by a number of specialists and partners on our training today. So let me introduce you to those. So I'm Fiona Quinlan-Wells from the SSE team. I'm our training officer. We're also joined today by Tiffany Grabsky, who is the head of the SSE Academy as well. So thanks for being here, Tiffany. Alongside us, we also have Fiona Pedaboy, who's the research associate at Global Canopy, supporting the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So big thank you to Fiona for being here as well to support us on this topic. And alongside us later in the session, I think we have Valentina here with us already. So hi to Valentina. We're joined by our guest speakers from S&P Global. So Valentina is an ESG client engagement specialist. And later in the workshop, we'll also be joined by Joseph Fink, who's the Director of Climate and Sustainability Services. So big thanks to our colleagues at S&P as well. And then one final voice that I'd like to introduce to you at start is the voice of a company perspective. So we've been fortunate in advance of our workshop today to record some interviews with a number of companies working on this topic. And today we're going to feature Patrick Ho, who is Head of Sustainable Development at Swire Properties. So we'll hear from him a number of times in the workshop, but let me play this video to introduce him to you now.
Hi everyone, this is Patrick Ho from Swire Properties. I'm the head of sustainable development of the company. Swire Properties is a real estate developer and property manager, and we are headquartered and listed in Hong Kong. I'm also a TNFD member who was involved in the formulation of the TNFD framework.
Great. So that introduces us to Patrick. We'll come back to hear his perspective from the company side and how he's worked to implement the TNFD within Swire Properties a number of times throughout the session. But just to get us started, now we know who everyone is who's joining us here today. We've got a quick poll question for you, which I'll launch now, which is just to get a sense of what your current understanding is on this topic. So the question you can answer here is a rating scale from 0 to 10 to let us know how well you feel you currently understand the link between nature and business. 0 being you're a brand new beginner on this topic, 10 being that you're very comfortable, maybe you're a real specialist on this topic already. So I'll give everyone a moment to answer this question. Of course, there's no wrong answers here. This is useful for us just to know what your existing understanding is of this topic before we start the session. I'll give everyone a couple more seconds to respond. I see a good number of you already participated, so thanks for that. And let's end the poll and I'll share the results. So it looks like the majority of us are saying we're somewhere between perhaps a 5 and an 8 out of 10 in our current understanding on this topic. So a little bit of a range, which is interesting to see. So thanks for letting us know. If you are someone already working on this topic, do feel free to keep sharing your perspectives in the exercises and the chat as we move through. It's always really interesting for other participants to hear from those who are implementing this as well. Great. And then another thing we're going to be doing now, as I've mentioned, is using the tool Menti. So we're going to warm up first by talking a little bit about some of the key terms. So I think we know that there's a number of terms that are used in this space. Maybe you've heard about nature, biodiversity, for example. We talked a bit about this in the pre-watch video that hopefully you had time to watch. So hopefully this is just a reminder if you had a chance to see that video. But if not, we know that it is important that we're clear up front by what we mean here. So we'll be talking about these concepts across our modules, and I'd like to get clear up front about them. Just to be clear, we're not necessarily expecting you to have word perfect definitions here, but we'd like to know what you currently understand by nature. So let me share my screen. Thanks, Tiffany, for sharing the link again in the chat to Menti. So be sure to check that link out. And also, now that you should be able to see the Menti screen, you've got a number of other ways to join us. So you can use that QR code that you'll see on the screen there. You can also go to menti.com and enter that 8-number code that you're seeing on the screen now. So take a moment to join us in Menti. We're going to be using this same tool a number of times during the session. So once you've got that link open, you'll be able to keep this page open in a tab and keep coming back to it when we do the exercises. But let's move on. Those details for you are still on the right-hand side of the screen here if you still need them. But the first question would be to ask you how you define nature. So please share with us maybe a couple of words, maybe one word, and what comes to mind for you when you would think of a definition for nature. So thanks everyone already. I see lots of great responses. So biodiversity, environment, life, wildlife, green, resources, the natural world. Okay, great. I mean, I think what's really interesting here already is I think we're seeing some clear themes, and I think we've all got a good understanding of what those themes are, but also such a variety of different terms. So I think that already underscores how important it is to all be talking the same language here. But I think really talking about the natural world, living components, non-living components on our Earth is a very good start, and we'll go into our official definition there shortly. And then let's have a go at another term here. So we've heard about nature. You've probably also heard mention of biodiversity. So do you know how that differs from nature? How would you define biodiversity? So take a moment to have a think. Oh, I see David Attenborough mentioned, yeah, a real hero on this topic, of course. Let's see. So we've got diversity of species, ecosystems, variability. I see flora and fauna, living organisms. Great. So maybe some similar terms, but the key ones coming up here look to be about variety, variability, and different species. So I think clearly lots of you already are understanding some of these concepts well. So great. Thanks, everyone. So thanks for your input there. So I'd encourage you, as I said, to keep Menti open as a tab, and we'll return to that a bit later in the session. But let me reshare my slides now, and we'll have a look together quickly at the key definitions for these terms. But I think it's clear that you already understand them well already, so I think we're on the same page here. So if we draw on how the TNFD defined these terms, so the TNFD has built up an extensive glossary of terminology in its work. You can find the link to that on the slide, and you can check that out after the session if you'd like to see some more terms. But they really drew on well-established work here from a number of bodies. And so setting out a definition of nature, the TNFD defined nature as, excuse me, let me just see if I can get it to move along. It's being a little slow. Yeah, there we go. Thanks, everyone. So nature is a definition in the TNFD that draws on the convention of biological diversity, but really places an emphasis on the living components of nature. So the TNFD framework focuses on these aspects. So non-living elements, which include energy and minerals, are considered to an extent, but only if they affect the health of living nature. So really centering that definition on the natural world, emphasizing living things, but including people. And so alongside that, as I said, biodiversity is another important concept. So biodiversity should be seen as a specific characteristic of nature. And it's really relating to the variability among living things. So well done to those of you who got that right. So if we think about these two terms together, one way to think about this, if we're thinking about maybe a forest as an example, is that nature is the forest itself, so the large area and ecosystem there. And then within that, biodiversity would be the variety of life in the forest. So the different species of trees, the animals, the fungi, the microorganisms in the soil. And so the entire forest, nature, is what gives us the space and resources, but it's biodiversity or that variety of species which helps to make the forest resilient and functional. So it's really important that we have both of those things for long-term resilience of the planet, for our own society as well, as we'll hear about shortly. So as I've mentioned, you can take a look at the TNFD's glossary if you'd like to understand these or other terms in more detail, but hopefully that's helped us to get clear upfront on a few key ones. Okay, great. So time to pass over to Tiffany now, and she's going to get us started on our recap of the first module. Thanks, Tiffany.
Great. Thanks very much, Fiona, and great job, everyone. I see many of you have watched the video, which is fantastic. So we're just going to do a quick overview of Module 1, which, as you may remember, is on understanding. So hopefully you've watched the video, and this is just a review, but for anyone who didn't have a chance to watch it, here's a chance for you to learn everything from that module. We do highly recommend you still watch it, though, and you need to do so to get your CPD certificate. So in the first module, our aim really is just to build a solid foundation on this topic. So what we covered in the module online was why nature matters, so why it's critical to act on nature at all scales, what businesses should do about nature, and the key considerations to get started in understanding this topic. And to round off the module, today, we're going to finish off with a further unit in today's live workshop on the investor perspective, and that's with the support of S&P Global, which Fiona introduced just a little while ago. Oops, I skipped through that, but let me just go back one slide. There we go. So just as a reminder, those first 2 units we discussed in the video recap. So if you did not watch it, please go back and watch it in order to get your CPD certificate. But let's do a quick recap now. To start off with, we're going to do another poll. So it should have just popped up on your screen. And the question here is, how many of the 9 planetary boundaries have we already breached? Hopefully you remember this from the video, a little bit of a quiz there. It looks like overwhelmingly a lot of you did watch the video, so congratulations. Many of you are getting this right. So I'm just going to actually end the poll. Have a think quick if you didn't have a chance to put it in the poll. And big congratulations, 7 indeed is the answer. Some of you said all 9, so some of you are already maybe looking to the future, a bit pessimistic, but 7 is a lot. So in 2025, and I think just going to check, yeah, we do have something on this slide here. There we go. There's the image you might remember from our module online. So in 2025, a scientific assessment showed that 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries had been transgressed. And what's important to highlight is that climate change is actually just one of them. Now, as a reminder, planetary boundaries are a framework scientists use to understand the environmental limits within which humanity can operate safely. So the fact that climate change is just one of these is really why we talk about nature beyond climate. So we need a much more integrated perspective when we're looking at sustainability here, one that recognizes how biodiversity, land use, freshwater, nutrient cycles, and many other systems are interconnected. And we need to act with real urgency because, as you can see, these systems are already under significant stress. We also talked about the fact that multiple ecosystem services are in decline, and ecosystem services, put very simply, are the benefits that we get from nature. So things like clean water, fertile soil, food, pollination, etc. And they're the natural systems that are quietly supporting our lives and our economies every day. Now, the leading global scientific body that assesses these trends, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, in 2019 warned in its global assessment that many of these ecosystem services are declining around the world and that we need urgent action to overcome this. So let's look at one other area we looked at in the training in Module 1, and that's that really every economy in the world is ultimately dependent to some extent on nature. And by extension, then, so does every single business. So at the moment, a lot of the value businesses extract from nature isn't fully priced into business valuation. Things like water, clean air, fertile soil, stable weather. These are all really essential inputs, but companies don't pay the true cost for using them or, importantly, damaging them. So why does that matter? Well, because fundamentally, businesses and nature are systematically interconnected. Businesses rely on nature to operate. We call those dependencies. And at the same time, business activities affect nature. These we call impacts. So the diagram here on your screen is how the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, represents that relationship. So on the left, you see nature and the services it provides, and on the right, you see business. And the arrows show really a two-way flow. Businesses depend on nature, and their actions impact nature in return. And when you put those dependencies and impacts together, they translate into risks and opportunities for companies. This is why it's important to recognize that nature is not just an environmental issue. It is a core strategic risk for organizations. What this means is that nature risk is financial risk. The future cash flows of businesses, whether they are corporates or financial institutions, depend on a continuous flow of benefits from nature. It's also important to remember that this isn't just about risk. Nature can also present powerful business opportunities that have positive outcomes for both businesses and nature. And of course, the opportunity doesn't always mean investing in something brand new. It can be as simple as applying what the business already does in a smarter, more sustainable way. And these opportunities can deliver benefits by, for example, reducing negative impacts and by creating positive outcomes for nature. For example, as customer expectations shift, companies can access new markets or locations by responding to a growing demand for nature positive products and services. So while nature loss brings real risks, it also opens the door to innovation, efficiency, new markets, and stronger long-term resilience. So let's do another quick quiz. So this one asks, which of these are the 4 realms of nature? So another important thing to remind ourselves of is the different aspects or realms of nature. And these are the different components that the TNFD uses to define what is part of the living natural world. So select all of those options that you think are correct. And hopefully you remember that. It looks like a lot of you do remember this from the video. And now as we can see in the diagram, oh, let me pop the diagram up. It's still not there. Oh, there we go. It's there. So you can see in this diagram, the TNFD's framework is based on 4 realms. So I'm going to end the poll now since the answer is there in front of you. It's land, fresh water, ocean, and atmosphere. So you got it correct. Well done, everyone. Now, another one that a few of you did select was society, which, is fair because you probably remember that from the training module 1 online. And that's because society sits at the center of these 4 realms. So it's not one of the 4 realms, but it sits at the center and is connected to all of them. So let's keep that in mind throughout the training today. Now, let's do one more quick quiz here. So what are key things businesses should know about nature? So which of these statements is correct? You can pick any one of them that you think is correct. The rest are incorrect. So first one is nature issues are the same for everyone and should be tackled using the same global approach by everyone. Second is nature risk is connected to all other risk types. The second is nature and climate should be approached separately. And the third is people and nature are 2 separate things and should be treated that way in risk management. I'm just going to give you another 3 seconds to pick the one that you think is correct. 3, 2, 1. Great job. And congratulations. The majority of you, more than half of you, picked the one that indeed is correct. It's the one that indicated that actually nature and what we're talking about today is interconnected. All the rest suggested that they were, that they were very separate, except for the first one, which suggested that it's the same for absolutely everyone. So let's discuss what we mean by these being correct or incorrect. So Our first option in the quiz indicated that nature was the same for everyone. So while climate change is actually a global process with one shared atmosphere, in contrast, nature and the drivers of nature change are actually quite location specific. So a business's nature-related dependencies and impacts on nature, which lead to risks and opportunities for that business, are highly location and context dependent. So they're very specific to that organization. They're shaped both by the sector in which the business operates and its geographic footprint. So organizations need to consider sensitivity alongside the locations which present material nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities to their organization to filter and prioritize what they work on. Now that brings us to the second option, which was correctly phrased. It said, we face a systemic landscape of risks which are interconnected, often in surprising and unexpected ways. So what is clear is that nature risks connect to and amplify other corporate risks. Now, the next poll option suggested that nature and climate should be separate. And as we learned in the video, however, business responses to nature and climate must actually be integrated. There are 5 impact drivers of nature change, including climate change, as well as land, water, or ocean use change, resource use, invasive species, and pollution. And climate change and the resulting increase in global temperatures is one of those drivers of nature degradation. So the increasing frequency and intensity of flooding, wildfires, and storms can disrupt the water cycle, alter soil temperatures, and accelerate habitat and wildlife loss. Now, the final option in our quiz separated out nature and people. But what's important to have very clear is that people are a part of nature. They're not separate from it. So remember when we had those 4 realms in that image we saw not long ago, society sat at the center of it. So it's not in any way separate. It's really connecting all of it. Now, also keep in mind when we talk about people, especially Indigenous peoples and local communities, these groups of society rely on nature for their livelihoods and can play actually a real critical role as stewards in conserving and restoring ecosystems. We're going to talk about that a lot today and come back to it a few times, but just keeping in mind that corporates and financial institutions can't address nature loss by acting alone. Great, so that's our recap. Let's move on and finish up this module now. So we've talked about the business case and market case for nature-related disclosures and some of the key concepts to understand when getting started. Now let's consider which stakeholder groups are interested in data and disclosure from businesses on nature. We'll talk more about this at the very end of our workshop on communication. But as we've been discussing, nature is increasingly shaping business strategy, risk, and opportunity. And as that happens, stakeholder expectations are also rapidly rising. And one particular stakeholder group this applies to and will be particularly relevant for many of you joining us today from listed companies is investors. Investors want to understand how nature risks can affect returns, creditworthiness, and long-term value, for example. So to help us get started on this topic, I'm very pleased to have a guest speaker with us today. Valentina from S&P is going to guide us through the investor and financial angle on nature and why it matters. I'm going to pass over to you, Valentina. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. Brilliant start to the presentation. So yeah, great. I'm Valentina from S&P, and the idea of the next couple of slides is to really start thinking about what these impacts and dependencies look like and how we can help identify those. Not only identify them, but also assess them, manage them, and especially when we're talking about location-specific nature-related risks. So for this first slide, based on the S&P 1200 study, the ecosystem footprint, one of the top sectors, is up to 32 million football pitches of the Amazon rainforest is being impacted from these top sectors. Now, this staggering figure really highlights the immense pressures that leading industries place on some of the planet's most biodiverse and ecological significant regions. So it really starts to paint this picture of the impacts that we're seeing, but it also shows that as we confront the significant ecological footprint of major industries, it really becomes increasingly clear that innovative kind of financial solutions are really essential for us to be able to foster kind of that sustainability and mitigate those nature-related risks alongside. So in this slide, we're examining the nature dependency risk and impact metrics alongside the S&P World Index Index's cumulative index performance. And what we have seen from backtesting performance is that low to high dependencies rankings. So companies with the lowest nature dependency risk as measured by scores outperformed to the S&P World Index, while those that we're seeing with the highest nature dependency risk underperformed. So it really highlights kind of the financial relevance of managing those nature-related dependencies for those companies in the study. So impacts and dependencies have been highlighted, and the impact is when we're focusing on is when we're especially in the nature transition side when climate change becomes more material. So when climate change becomes more material, it is increasingly important to really recognize that nature must be part of the equation, right? So especially as we're talking about that energy transition aspect of it. So here on this slide, what we're looking at is data that includes kind of mines in following stages such as development stages, late exploration, as well as early exploration. Closed mines are excluded in this study, but you can see here when we're looking at the commodities on the bottom right, that minerals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite are essential for those technologies that are really driving that low carbon transition. So what are we trying to depict here and reflect on is that global demand, well, as global demand for these minerals accelerates, mining activities are increasing and expanding into the regions that are not only just mineral rich, but really have that ecological significance as well. So think of this as the nature-based, basically equivalence of carbon footprint. You know, it measures the environmental impact of a company's operations by calculating the area of ecosystems that are being affected. So, in other words, it shows how much natural land and habitat is impacted by business activities as well. So when we spoke a little bit earlier and what was covered in earlier slides is what we talk about when we mention key biodiversity areas. So just to kind of revise, the key biodiversity areas are specific geographic areas that are critical for the conservation of biodiversity. So these areas are identified based on their importance, but also for the persistence of biodiversity, not only including species, but things like the ecosystem as well as the ecological processes. So to get you thinking a little bit and to kind of bring up a poll question, what we want to ask is which percentage of companies in the S&P 1200s have operations overlapping with key biodiversity areas? Okay, very active, which is great. So we've got quite a few, but 12% at 50 to 59. Then we've got 16, 17% from 60 to 69. We've got 24% at 70 to 79%. Let's try and get to, okay, brilliant. Let's try and get to 50% of votes. Okay, fantastic. I'm going to end the poll now. Great. So I hope you can see the results. We've got the leading number at 70 to 79%. At 23% of you said 70 to 79%, and then quite a few of you said 60 to 69%, and only 3% at 90 to 100%. So from that, I think I can stop sharing those results. And the overall percentage was 71% of companies. So 71% of companies in the S&P 1200 have operations overlapping with those KBAs, which does feel like a very significant value because you start thinking about the kind of sorry, I saw there was an echo on the chat. Fiona, can you hear an echo?
You're all good for me, Valentina.
Oh,
I'm
okay,
just
brilliant.
replacing.
Okay, thanks. So thinking about impact, it also goes hand in hand with also considering those dependencies aspects as well, not only the impacts, but also the dependencies. So to remind ourselves what dependencies are, we're looking at the interaction between what is the level of reliance on these ecosystem services, but also the resilience of the ecosystem being able to provide that flow of services. And yes, of course, everyone is dependent on nature. But here, what we're really highlighting is that 50%, 57% of the world's largest companies face significant dependency risk on nature across their direct operations. So again, where we defined nature risk as a combination of high dependence and ecosystem service at risk. So given the criticality of kind of the nature of these dependencies, one will start to ask, why are so many companies still facing or still falling short in their commitment to biodiversity? So when we're talking about, and according to the latest S&P Corporate Sustainability Assessment, which is what we refer to as a CSA, the majority of companies worldwide do not have public biodiversity policies or commitments. So this gap is especially pronounced when we're looking outside of leading regions and sectors, with significant variation across different geographies, as we can see, both geographies and industries, as we can see on this slide. So, for example, on the left-hand side, when we're focusing on that region aspect of it, areas like a region such as Latin America and Africa have the highest share of companies with biodiversity commitments, while regions such as the US and the Middle East kind of lagging behind. When we're looking at the sector, utilities and energy sectors are more likely to have those policies in place, but most other sectors far less engaged. So overall, for the CSA, only a quarter of companies globally undertaking the CSA have made biodiversity a formal part of their sustainability strategy. So to start kind of showing or creating that story with that including biodiversity as a formal part of their sustainability strategy, it's important to consider for nature and biodiversity, it's also significantly impacts the environmental, social, and governance scores, those ESG scores, as they are an integral component of the environmental criteria within the ESG framework, alongside climate strategy, water, waste and pollutants, and many others. So what this is really kind of reflecting, and the story kind of that we want to bring home, is that they reflect that companies' environmental performance, the risk management capabilities alongside and commitment to sustainability are really reflected through these. So organizations that prioritize that biodiversity and the biodiversity aspect within that environmental sector are better positioned to enhance those ESG ratings and meet the growing kind of expectations of both investors and stakeholders as well. And just to summarize here, from what we've just spoken about in the last couple of slides is, okay, increasing relevance of nature for capital markets. We also mentioned that through this climate transition, it is inevitably linked to nature and biodiversity. We talked about those overlapping key biodiversity areas with kind of those leading sectors, and then also the expansion of mines to be able to help with that energy transition. And then companies are directly exposed to nature-related impacts and dependencies, but those companies, and there are companies that are not fully prepared for risks and opportunities, which will then impact those ESG scores, as they are very linked to transparency as well as the performance of on biodiversity as well. So I will hand it back to Fiona, I believe, and any questions, please feel free to send them in the chat. I will be around to answer them. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Valentina. I think we've had a couple of questions just particularly on the concept of key biodiversity areas. So that would be great if you could respond to those. But thanks so much for the presentation. And I think hopefully really helped to evidence, as you say, to everyone, the increasing financial relevance of this topic and the apparent interest of investors as well. So if you weren't already thinking this was a good thing to be focusing on for other reasons, I think, of course, there's some really key drivers on that front as well. Great. So that brings us to the end now of our first module. So we've recapped what we talked about in our preparatory video and given you a little bit of a quiz there. And then we've talked a little bit more specifically about investors. So let's just go through a few of the key points to summarize this segment. So firstly, I think the really simple and key one is that every business depends on nature. So this isn't just about farming or resource extraction. We hope that we've demonstrated to you that all sectors and regions of our economy and society rely on nature in some way. And the bottom line is that because of this universal dependence, nature is a topic that every single organization does need to understand and to address. We've also heard that nature isn't an isolated issue. We've highlighted that it's interconnected with other societal issues. So nature-related risks can easily connect to or amplify other major corporate risks, which really makes the global risk landscape quite complex. And also location, location, location. So your exposure to nature-related dependencies, risks, and opportunities is highly dependent on where you operate. So your geographic footprint and your specific sector and your value chain, it's a location-specific challenge, and that's an important element to understand. And then finally, as Valentina shared with us, investors are increasingly recognizing the financial materiality of nature-related issues, and they're factoring that into their decision-making. And so that's going to then lead to a greater demand for disclosure from companies. So hopefully we're now all feeling refreshed on some of the core concepts and drivers behind why nature is an important topic to be looking at. So now we're going to move into the new content for our training today, and we'll get started with the Align module, which Tiffany's going to set us off on.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. So our next module moves us into considering the frameworks and guidance that are available to support you in making nature-related disclosures. In order to do this, we'll look at three key concepts in this unit. So the first, we'll introduce the TNFD and its adoption by the market. Once we cover that, we will also discuss how to use the recommendations and the expansive guidance that's been developed by the TNFD. And then finally, we'll explore how the TNFD aligns with and supports other reporting standards. So to begin, let's focus on understanding what the TNFD is, why it was formed, and so pleased to have TNFD itself, Fiona representing them here today to explain that to you. So over to you, Fiona.
Thanks so much, Tiffany, and hello to everybody, and thanks so much for joining. Great to see so many people online from such a range of geographies. Really excellent. So what I'll do today is I'll just introduce you to the TNFD. So the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or as we know it, TNFD, is a market-led science-based initiative. Its mission is really to develop and deliver a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on evolving nature-related issues. So what we mean by nature-related issues are nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. The task force provides companies and financial institutions with recommendations and guidance about how to incorporate nature beyond climate into their decision-making, and provides a globally recognized approach to assess and disclose nature-related issues. So as part of this pack, there's a few extra slides that cover how the TNFD was developed, its history, and why organizations are using its recommendations. So you can explore those in your own time. So I'll just say a little bit more about the relevance of TNFD's recommendations. So in September of 2023, after 2 years in design and development, the TNFD launched its final recommendations for nature-related risk management and disclosure, building on the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so the TCFD. The disclosure recommendations and guidance encourage and enable business and finance to assess, report, and to act on their nature-related issues, enabling nature to be integrated into their decision-making processes, encouraging organizations to view nature as a strategic risk management issue and as an opportunity. So the TNFD recommendations are designed for organizations of really all sizes across many sectors and along value chains. So overall, the recommendations and guidance are relevant to a wide range of market participants and market enablers, as we show on this slide. So the TNFD framework has been designed to help organizations address nature-related issues within their specific context, as we previously highlighted the importance of location, and is really relevant to multiple audiences. So we'll, in the next segment, dig a little more into those 14 disclosure recommendations that have been developed by the TNFD. In September of 2025, the TNFD released its first status report, which shows significant market uptake of the TNFD's recommendations and its guidance. So we've got some really interesting figures to just highlight here. 78% of those companies that have already reported have integrated the presentation of their climate and nature reporting. 63% of companies and financial institutions surveyed for the report believe that nature-related issues are as significant, if not more significant, than climate-related issues to the future prospects of their business. So while we recognize that the assessment of nature-related issues remains new and is perceived to be rather complicated and complex, the report highlights what's possible with the use of existing metrics and by building on existing internal capabilities. So really using existing data. As of November 2025, there are 733 TNFD adopters worldwide. This marks a 46% increase in market commitment to TNFD-aligned reporting since the COP16 in Cali in November of 2024. Drawn from 56 countries or areas, including from 26 emerging markets, and across 64 of 77 SASB 6 sectors, the publicly listed companies now represent over $9.4 trillion in market capitalization, which is an increase of 44% since November 2024. We also have 179 financial institutions which are now underway with TNFD-aligned reporting, which represents $22.4 trillion in assets under management. This marks a 27% increase from COP16, including 25% of the world's systematically important banks. So these are all extremely encouraging results. We currently also have the 2026 survey, which is now open. It will be closing on Friday, 14th of August. So if ever relevant to you, do please take part. The survey for 2026 will be published during New York Climate Action Week in September. So do keep an eye out for that when it comes. I'll hand back to Tiffany to take us through the next section. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. So now I think you have a really great overview of all the hard work of Fiona and her team. But since this module is about making use of the global standards to keep you on the right track, let's take a bit of time to walk through what are the resources that you can use to help you and how can you best use these recommendations and guidance. Let's start with a poll because we want to know a bit about you. Is your company using the TNFD guidance and recommendations? Obviously, there's no right or wrong answer here. This is just a chance for us to get to know where you are all at. I'll give you maybe 10 seconds to fill that in. Just a quick answer of whether or not you are already using the TNFD's recommendations and guidance. I see some of you, we're at about over 40 of you are using it already so far. And that number continues to climb. Actually, you're using it and reporting on nature. Some of you are familiar with the TNFD guidance, over 100 of you are familiar with it, but you're not necessarily reporting on it yet. I see nearly 300 of you are not using the TNFD recommendations in any way. and some of you are not sure exactly what's happening within your company using these guidance. I'm going to end the poll there. So it looks like the majority of you say no. So this is a good opportunity. Hopefully we can share with you how you can be using this guidance and recommendations, even just to get started, to understand your company's dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So to get started, I think it's really important to be clear that the TNFD is not simply 14 recommended disclosures, which many of you are probably familiar with, given the high level of recognition of this topic you all had at the start. So before walking through those 14 recommended disclosures, which we will discuss today, we firstly wanted to make sure that you understood kind of the context and the additional resources that collectively should guide your final disclosures. There's a lot of concepts on this slide, and I don't want to go through each in extreme detail, but I do want you to understand how these concepts support each other. So let's start at the bottom of the slide with the conceptual foundations, which are like a set of principles that help you understand how the recommendations were designed. These principles include the basis and approach to materiality used by the TNFD, the comprehensiveness of identification and assessment of nature-related issues that is expected, and the expectations for increasing the breadth and the depth of disclosure ambition over time. Put very simply, these four concepts at the bottom of the slide really help to clarify what expectations and basic definitions underpin all the rest of the guidance, and importantly, those 14 recommendations that you'll become quite familiar with. Next, these four conceptual foundations then create the base for the 6 general requirements. And these are general aspects about a company's approach to nature-related disclosures that provide the key contextual information that's needed for investors and other report users to best understand your full disclosures. So then these 6 general disclosures, which we'll talk about momentarily, go together with the 14 voluntary recommended disclosures, which are grouped in 4 categories you might be familiar with: governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. So hopefully this makes clear kind of how these conceptual foundations build an understanding of the recommendations and the disclosures that are expected to be shared publicly, and also how you can use the 6 general disclosure recommendations to provide that context needed for the 14 recommended disclosures. So that's the real high-level picture of the disclosure recommendations. But let's look at those general requirements for a moment here. So as I just mentioned, the purpose of those general requirements is to provide the context for the more detailed 14 recommended disclosures. So these 6 requirements help ensure consistency and comparability across different reports. One note to keep in mind is that these 6 general requirements should actually be used in addition to the general requirements of the ISSB's IFRS S1 standard. So if your organization does choose to state publicly that it is using or aligning with the TNFD recommendations, it is expected to apply these 6 TNFD requirements as well as the 5 ISSB general requirements. Again, those are also to provide context to the reporting that you're going to be disclosing. Now, that answers also one of the questions we've seen in the Q&A about the connection between TNFD and ISSB, and I think you'll see today that they're very much connected. So just to note that these general requirements apply across all those 4 pillars of the TNFD recommended disclosures: governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. I won't go through each of these individually because you can do that on your own time, but I wanted to flag just one to discuss today. And if you're familiar with the IFRS sustainability standards, I think you'll be fairly comfortable with most of the concepts on this slide. But one of the general requirements that is quite specific to the discussion related to nature is number 6 on this slide: engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. Now, this requirement recognizes that the people closest to nature often hold essential knowledge and are most affected by nature-related decisions. So organizations are expected to describe how they engage with these important groups in a meaningful and also culturally appropriate way. I wanted to flag this because you will see momentarily that there are also specific disclosure recommendations within the 14 recommended disclosures that relate to specific aspects of engagement activities with these groups. But since this is also a general recommendation, it actually applies to all 4 of the pillars of the recommended disclosures. And that means that engagement with these groups should be addressed in all 4 pillars of the recommended disclosures. Now, make sure to make good use of these general recommendations because together they create really the backbone of TNFD aligned reporting, ensuring disclosures are transparent, comparable, and grounded in real robust processes. Now let's go into those 14 recommended disclosures. So keeping in mind that those 6 general requirements apply to all of these recommended disclosures, these disclosures are organized by those 4 pillars, which mirrors the structure many of you will recognize from the TCFD and then translated into the ISSB standards. So first we have the pillar of governance, which focuses on how the organization is governed with respect to nature. And this includes disclosures about board oversight, about management, and about engagement activities. Then we also have on the pillar on strategy. Here, the organization explains how nature affects its business model and its strategy. Then we have the pillar on risk and impact management, and this pillar describes the processes that an organization uses to identify, assess, and prioritize and monitor nature-related issues. And then the 4th pillar, the turquoise green one there, this recommends that organizations disclose the metrics and the targets that they use to measure and manage nature-related issues. So this pillar really shows how performance is being tracked and managed over time. So together, the 14 recommended disclosures across these 4 pillars give stakeholders a very clear picture of how an organization is governing, planning, managing, and measuring its relationship with nature. They also support consistency with other global reporting standards. Now, remember that each of these should be employed with the general requirements we just talked through, but let's look at how this looks in real life with some examples. I think that brings it to life a little. A quick disclaimer though, remember that all the examples we provide in our workshop are simply examples of real life practices. So we're not endorsing them or suggesting that you should do exactly as this company is doing. As I mentioned earlier today, remember that nature is really specific to your organization. So what fits or suits another company does not necessarily mean it's the best approach for you to use. So let's start with governance. So we're going to take an example from Swire Properties. We've been introduced to them already with one of our videos, but we're going to look at their 2024 climate and nature-related financial disclosure to see how some organizations are approaching the TNFD governance recommendations and practice. First, a quick overview. So under the TNFD governance pillar, organizations are asked to describe 3 things. First, the board's oversight of nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. Sometimes we call those DIROs. Second, the management's role in assessing and managing these issues. And then third, the relevant human rights policies and also engagement activities, including oversight of engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. So in the Swire Properties example, we can see several of these components. First, they outline how the board of directors sets and approves strategic direction on sustainability matters, including climate and nature-related issues, and this helps us understand board oversight. Next, the disclosure sets out the role of the ESG steering committee and various working groups, which illustrates how management reviews risks, how they develop strategy, and how they monitor progress against KPIs related to climate and nature. And finally, there we go. This example shows several policies which together indicate the organization's stated commitment and frameworks that support engagement and oversight. So for example, you can see here their policy on human rights and other key areas. So this example has some aspects for all 3 of the recommended disclosures under the governance pillar. We've also included in our slide deck a second example from Japan Airlines, which you can go and review on your own time. It also has a few little notes in it from us, but I'm going to continue on to the strategy pillar now. So we're going to see how a few companies are disclosing information about the effects of nature-related issues on their business model, strategy, and financial planning. But just as a reminder, in the strategy pillar, organizations are asked to describe 4 things. First, what are the nature-related DIROs, dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities that have been identified over the short, medium, and long term? Second is, what are the effects of nature through these DIROs that the organization might see on their business model, their value chain, their strategy, and their financial planning? Also, any transition plans or analysis that was used to determine these effects. The third is how resilient its strategy is when considering different scenarios and assessing nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And then finally, what assets or activities are located in locations that are considered to be priority locations or sensitive locations when it comes to nature sensitivities. So with that in mind, this example is from a financial institution. It's called Robeco. Robeco is a pure play global asset manager and a leader in sustainable investing. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we'll just make that image a little bit larger there. They have provided in their integrated annual report 2 donut graphs illustrating the amount of assets under management in their portfolio that have a high or very high impact or dependency on biodiversity. So this introduces the dependencies and impacts identified in their portfolio where their money is being used. So this also, however, sets the scene for the second image here, which shows the main steps to their biodiversity investment framework, so their strategy. Robeco evaluates how well companies are addressing biodiversity loss and differentiates between leaders and laggards. Furthermore, they have indicated in their report that starting in 2024, they're going to be using this framework to guide their investment decision-making, which helps report users really understand how the impacts and dependencies then influence Robeco's strategy. So we've also included a second strategy example in your slide deck again, which you can take a look at on your own time. But in the interest of time, we're going to move to the next pillar here, which is risk and impact management. Now, as a quick reminder, under TNFD's risk and impact management pillar, organizations are asked to describe 3 things. First, the processes used to identify, assess, and prioritize DIROs both in the company's direct operations as well as in its upstream and downstream value chain. Second, the processes for managing those DIROs, the dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And third, how these processes are integrated into and how they inform the overall risk management processes. So as you may have heard, I said processes many times there. So this section is all about processes, how our risk management unfolds. Because of this, we often see quite a narrative description in this aspect of our disclosure. Now let's take an example here. This one's from EMEA Power. It's from their 2024 TNFD report. EMEA Power is a solar technology and project developer in the UAE. So this table here is quite useful to see a quick summary of the risks, the implications, and the management of those risks, as well as the identification of opportunities too. So as you may remember from our example in strategy, in the strategy pillar, this is where we have disclosure recommendations related to the identification of and the effects of nature-related risks and opportunities. But here we also have the management and mitigation of those risks, providing real examples to really add color to the process that these companies are describing. So for example, we can see in this table that the company conducts a biodiversity action plan to protect and restore habitats to mitigate the risks of impact on threatened species. I think another important aspect of this particular example here is you can see we have both an example of the strategy pillar, what we're asking there, and information from the risk and management pillar. And this is how disclosures unfold. They're not separated in silos. These pillars are simply to help us understand the objective of certain disclosures, but they do appear kind of all together in the same area. Great, so let's take one more example. We're going to stay with the same company, but we're going to go on to metrics and targets. So just as a reminder, in the metrics and targets pillar, organizations are asked to describe, again, 3 things. First, the metrics that are used to assess and manage nature-related risks and opportunities, as well as then the metrics that are used to assess and manage nature-related dependencies and impacts. And then finally, the targets and goals used to manage and measure their performance on these metrics. Great, so we're coming back to EMEA Power, and here we have a table that they have to list the metrics that they are using. And as you can see here, there are some metrics that are under review and others that have been provided. I think this provides a good overview of the types of metrics you might see in nature-related disclosures. But just to note that a table like this isn't, enough to fulfill this whole requirement. What we also need to see is how these connect back to those dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities identified. What is the starting point for the metrics, the baseline, and what is the associated target and goal, and how we plan to achieve that goal. So the metrics are really part of the whole story that your disclosures are discussing. Great. So just to note, there is one more slide in your handout with one more example, specifically looking at time horizons, which, as you might remember, is a general requirement that we explain our time horizons. So I'll leave that to you to look at on your own time. But to wrap up, now I want to come back to all the additional guidance that can help you with these disclosures. So remember, as what we're disclosing, we have those, the general requirements we discussed, and then the 14 recommended disclosures in those 4 different key areas there. But the TNFD certainly recognizes that nature is indeed a complex area to look at, and that the way nature affects an organization can really hugely vary depending on sector and also biome. So because of this nuance, TNFD offers guidance specifically for certain sectors and also for specific biomes. So sectors include things like financial institutions, metals and minings, etc. Biomes include things like forests, grasslands, rivers, for example. And importantly, this guidance is designed to be flexible and practical. So you only need to review and use the parts that are actually relevant to your organization. And these guidance documents really help you to interpret and apply the TNFD recommendations specifically for your location and sector. Now, in addition to sector and biome guidance, the TNFD also provides material that supports kind of the full set of recommendations for any sector and any location. So this is relevant to all of you. First is the guidance on the LEAP approach. This is a practical step-by-step method that TNFD, has developed to help organizations identify and assess and prioritize nature-related issues. It's really the practices behind the scenes that'll get you moving, and we'll talk quite a bit about the LEAP approach today. There's also guidance on value chains and also on engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. We'll also talk about these throughout our training, but just to flag that those are available to everyone. And then finally, there is also specific guidance on certain pillars. So for example, there's scenario analysis guidance, which really supports the strategy disclosures by helping organizations explore how different nature futures or the future of nature could affect your business. And then there's also metrics and targets guidance, so including sector-specific metrics and information on setting science-based targets for nature. So altogether, this is a package of additional guidance that's designed to help organizations move from simply disclosing information to actually managing nature-related risks and opportunities in a structured way. I see a lot of thumbs up, so hopefully you now see all the breadth of guidance and resources available to you as you get started in this journey, and I hope you make use of all of them. Now, before we wrap up this unit, I just wanted to come back to engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. I brought this up when we discussed the general disclosure requirements. And as we've already seen, the TNFD's general requirements and recommended disclosures ask that organizations describe different aspects of engagement with these important groups. So in addition to this, there's also dedicated guidance on engagement to support organizations which aim to provide practical information and support to organizations on engagement that we'll share in the chat, so you can take a look at that. But in addition to this, as you can see on this slide, there's important guidance also found on this topic in the guidance for specific sectors. So for example, the TNFD sector guidance for financial institutions states that they need to work with the corporates that they support or finance to ensure that those corporates are undertaking the necessary engagement activities using a best practice approach. So as you can see, all of this guidance are really designed to be used together and flexibly, depending on the stage you're at, where you're working, your sector, your particular location, etc. So I don't think there's a lack of guidance to get you going. Now, let's hear it from someone. Oh, sorry, where to find more? Let's look at the TNFD Knowledge Hub, because I just listed, a ton of guidance documents and resources. They're all in one place. So don't worry, you can find all of this on the TNFD Knowledge Hub. You can also find the UNSSE's model guidance on nature-related financial disclosures on that hub, where we discuss everything that we've been talking about today. Now it's time to hear from somebody who's already working on this. Let's come back to Patrick at Swire Properties to hear his experience using all of these guidance and tools.
The most tangible strategic value has been the improved capacity to future-proof our asset portfolio and help us to de-risk our long-term investment by translating nature from a more peripheral concern into a core strategic input. And this value is realized in two key areas. Firstly, on risk management. TNFD gave us the evidence-based language to formally include nature in our corporate risk register. We can now clearly articulate that deteriorating natural capital actually threatens the stability and cost of our building material supply that directly impact the construction budgets and timelines. And secondly, and more importantly, it helps us unlock our view of commercial opportunities. Our TNFD work provides a robust business case for investing in nature-based solutions, as not as a cost center, but as a strategic advantage. For example, our green space at Taikoo Place in Hong Kong are now quantifiable assets that help us to enhance the climate resilience and community well-being. And a lot of research also shows that high quality open green space is a top factors influencing office rentals. And this is shift sort of internal perception from nature is now seen as a driver of market advantage, tenant attraction, and asset value. And ultimately, TNFD has given us a new lens for capital allocation, allowing us to invest more effectively in resilience and value creation.
Great. So see if I can move forward here. Sorry, slides are just a bit delayed. There we go. Maybe I moved too far. Thanks, Fiona. I think you've fixed it for me. But good to hear there from Patrick that, as we've been talking about, it's not about communicating just about nature. It's making that connection to the risks and opportunities facing your organization. So with that, we're going to move on to the last unit of this module. I'm going to pass back to Fiona at TNFD. Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Tiffany. So as I walked through earlier, TNFD is a market-led task force that provides recommendations to enhance nature-related risk management and corporate reporting. And I'll give you a little bit more about the global climate and nature-related reporting sort of architecture landscape, and hopefully answer some of the questions that I've seen in the chat. So it's really important to note that the TNFD is not a standard setter, but the recommendations are intended to be drawn on by standard setters, like the ISSB, GRI, and the SRS, as they themselves also develop topical reporting standards focused on issues of nature and biodiversity. The TNFD is aligned with the GBF, so the Global Biodiversity Framework, at the international level. The GBF's Target 15 specifically calls on governments to put in place requirements for corporate reporting on nature-related risks, dependencies, and impacts, and all this by 2030. So over 190 governments have committed to introduce corporate reporting requirements related to nature by 2030 in Target 15 of the GBF. The TNFD recommendations and guidance are designed to enable the goals and targets of this of the GBF, specifically Target 15. So a little bit more, as I mentioned, on interoperability and the TNFD framework. Overall, the development of the TNFD recommendations and its additional guidance have contributed to the ongoing development of nature-related disclosure standards globally. The TNFD's multi-year collaborations with sustainability standards bodies have resulted in a high level of consistency in the nature-related information recommended to be disclosed by corporates and financial institutions. So TNFD has really worked closely with standards bodies to harmonize concepts, definitions, and approaches to really ensure that organizations can report on their nature-related issues in a consistent and comparable manner. This is really to help streamline reporting processes across a range of topics for organizations. So what I'll do now is take you through a quick look at some of the key developments and considerations the TNFD has taken to align with various standards. So in terms of TNFD's alignment with the ISSB and the TCFD, the ISSB drew strongly on the work of the TCFD in developing its S1 and S2 standards, and there is close alignment between the TCFD and the TNFD. As we've seen, the TNFD includes the same 4 pillars as those that are included in the TCFD, carrying over 11 recommended disclosures and added 3 new disclosures that are specifically relevant to nature. A more recent development is that as of November of 2025, the ISSB announced its intention to undertake standard setting on nature to introduce incremental disclosure requirements. In April 2026, the ISSB decided its proposed form of standard setting on nature would be a practice statement, so a form of standard setting with the full effect of an IFRS standard. This is intended to give nature-related disclosure requirements more visibility and prominence, whilst also minimizing disruption to the substantial implementation efforts already underway on IFRS S1 and S2. So hopefully this answers a few of the questions as well in the chat. The ISSB is targeting having an exposure draft of incremental disclosure requirements ready by the CBD, so COP17 in October of 2026. In an immediate response to this, TNFD has announced that it will complete its technical work it currently has in progress by the third quarter of 2026, and then pause any future technical work from June of 2026. However, with this in mind, capacity building is very much still underway, recognizing obviously the importance of upskilling the market. ISSB's chair, Emmanuel Faber, has encouraged market participants to continue using the TNFD framework. It will really help you prepare disclosures in accordance with IFRS S1 and prepare for meeting future incremental ISSB disclosure requirements. He's also highlighted that the ISSB's IFRS S1 standard already covers general requirements for disclosure of information about an organization's sustainability-related risks and opportunities, which obviously could include nature. So just moving on to the ESRS and alignment with the ESRS. The TNFD guidance and disclosure recommendations are also consistent with these standards, so the European sustainability standards. So the scope of the assessment includes all ESRS environmental standards beyond climate, so E2 to E5. For organizations wishing to disclose under both the ESRS and the TNFD, we have developed this correspondence mapping that you can see on the screen, and it's a really helpful starting point for organizations to better understand the alignment. ESRS requires companies to conduct materiality assessment on environmental topics beyond climate, including pollution, water, biodiversity, and ecosystems, as well as circular economy. And it states that the LEAP approach can be used for this activity. So the LEAP approach in turn can inform both the TNFD disclosure recommendations as well as ESRS requirements. So currently the European Sustainability Reporting Standards are going through the final stages of its review as part of the European Commission's Omnibus Simplification Initiative, and we should hear more by the end of the year. So to provide also another example of interoperability work that the TNFD has been engaged in, we have developed this document, this mapping exercise, which looks at both the key alignment, but also differences in approaches between TNFD and the Global Reporting Initiative. And some of those differences include, for example, the GRI only focuses on impacts, whilst TNFD also covers dependencies, risks, as well as impacts. So I would encourage anyone looking for more information to consult this interoperability mapping to better understand alignment in terms of recommendations as well as metrics alignment with the GRI. So moving on slightly, just to clarify a little bit, because it's often a recurring question, TNFD's approach to materiality. So TNFD has a flexible approach to materiality, allowing companies needing or wanting to apply either financial or double materiality lens to report in accordance with the TNFD recommendations. The TNFD recommendations have been designed to be relevant across jurisdictions and the different approaches to materiality now in use. So the disclosures recommended by the TNFD do not stipulate whether organizations should take a financial or an impact materiality approach in their public disclosures. So instead, the recommendations are designed really to be flexible and can be applied through different materiality lenses. So if you choose to take a financial materiality lens, you will need to meet the information needs of capital providers consistent with the ISSB IFRS standards, with a focus on risk management and how dependencies and impacts on nature create risks and opportunities for organizations' financial position and prospects. Now, if you're applying an impact materiality lens, you'll need to meet the information needs of stakeholders focused on impacts aligned with a broader materiality approach, reporting against both ISSB and the GRI or ESRS standards. So companies overall should really consider the material information needs of their stakeholders, the standards applied in their industry or region, as well as the regulatory requirements in their jurisdiction. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit more about TNFD's materiality approach, as well as the sort of broader landscape of reporting and how the TNFD relates to that. I'll hand back to you, Fiona. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Fiona. So fantastic. I think that brings us now to the end of our second module. So we're going to take a moment now just to recap again on a few key points as we've come to the end of this segment and just cover off a little bit more about what we've heard. So the starting point that we talked about is really that TNFD provides us with a roadmap. There's a clear set of disclosure recommendations and supporting guidance, which is really designed to empower businesses and financial institutions to systematically assess, report, and act on nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So it's really designed as a flexible framework for translating nature-related issues into business strategy. And as we've heard, it's a market-led, science-based approach with that central mission to support the global shift to move financial flows away from activities that are harming nature and towards those that ultimately benefit and manage those risks. And it's also globally aligned. So this effort is directly supporting the objectives of the Global Biodiversity Framework, really integrating nature into the heart of financial decision-making. Great to see so many reactions coming through as well. Thanks, everyone. It's great to see that you're enjoying the training. Thanks for letting us know. And then the second thing that we covered in this segment is that there is a wealth of supporting material available to you. So the TNFD has developed an extensive range of resources to support adoption across every sector and geography. So whilst we know that that can feel like a lot of information and perhaps a little bit overwhelming, what's really important to remember here is that these materials have been designed to be used flexibly based on your specific needs. So you don't need to go away and read all of these different documents. You really just need to know that they're there and to check out the TNFD's Knowledge Hub and then navigate that to find the resource that really is going to support you, depending on your sector, your location, the particular type of nature-related issue you want to assess. And then finally, as we've heard, the TNFD is designed to fit with your existing reporting. So it was developed to be applied flexibly and in combination with other major reporting standards and frameworks. So you can make use of the TNFD's materials to support your nature-related disclosures, whether you're reporting using the ISSB standards, the GRI, or the ESRS, and we'll see more coming on that, as we've heard later this year as well, in particular from the ISSB. So be sure to stay tuned for more on that. Fantastic. So that does bring us to the end of our second module. We're about to take our short break, but before we do have a couple of minutes available just to recap on questions from this section. And so I just invite maybe Fiona, if you're open, and perhaps Tiffany as well, to join me, and maybe we can just come through a few questions together. Fiona, I think one topic I've seen coming up quite a lot in the Q&A throughout this segment is probably quite a lot of interest in the connection between ISSB and TNFD, and a few organisations perhaps highlighting quite rightly that the TNFD's work is going to be a really heavy informant of those standards. So I guess what advice would you maybe give to companies about how to approach that, and maybe what they can be doing to get ready for that practice statement from the ISSB?
Thanks. The TNFD is very much working in collaboration with the ISSB, so there will be alignment in terms of requirements to avoid any kind of discrepancy. So I would just encourage for organizations to keep assessing or keep doing the work they're doing, and to keep going, and they can then help hopefully integrate any of the data, the assessments they've gathered to disclose against both. They, in their report, can also provide a bit of a mapping exercise of how some of the data gathered matches against the TNFD as well as the ISSB. We've seen some examples of that done, and it kind of helps provide this sort of interoperability and highlight where where the data provided fits into different reporting standards.
Fantastic, thanks. That's super helpful, and yeah, definitely echo that. And Tiffany as well, maybe just to pick up on another kind of common theme I think we've seen in the Q&A is a lot of our participants quite interested in the methods around nature-related scenario analysis, maybe how to get started on that, and its connection to climate scenario analysis as well. So is there anything maybe you could share on that point too?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I've been seeing a lot of questions on that, and I think they're very well-based questions. Also, I'm sure, Fiona, you'd agree, we get this a lot in our training on the ISSB standards as well, because it's something that many people feel very new to, especially when we're talking to sustainability teams or strategy teams that might not be as familiar with different risk management practices. Just to remind everyone, a scenario analysis is not an expectation that you know what's going to happen in the future. None of us know that, right? We're not expected to be mind readers. But what it does help us understand is using science that's already been developed, helping to understand what might change in different scenarios. So, if we're gonna, go to a drought situation because of different climate change interactions that we're gonna see in the future, what would that mean for our company and how prepared we are for that? So it helps us kind of do a thought exercise to understand what might happen if XYZ happens in the future. And it gives you the science behind those suggested possible futures, and they could be very varied. You know, we'd like to do one that might be really unrealistic and one that maybe is very realistic, and something in between, to really make sure our company is going to survive those various different outputs. So just a reminder to everyone, it's about helping us prepare for the future using the science that's available now. It's not expecting you to know what's going to happen in the future. Maybe I'll leave it at there, Fiona. I think we could probably talk about scenario analysis for the next 3 hours, but I'll stop there for now.
Absolutely. No, thanks, Tiffany. That's super helpful as a starting point. And I've just shared the guidance from TNFD on that topic again in the chat with everyone as well, which we'd encourage you to check out. Fantastic. So I think in the interest of time, we'll move on and we'll take our break now. So please do keep coming with your questions, though. We'll hopefully have a little bit more time to discuss a few more of them later in the session. Thanks as well. I should have introduced my colleague, Corley, who's available in the background, who's answering a lot of your questions. Corley is managing our current work stream on nature action planning for exchanges. So thanks to Corley for all of her support in answering those questions, as well as our other panelists. But yeah, let's take a 10-minute break. So what we'll do is we'll play you a video with a bit of music for 10 minutes. You'll see a timer on the screen, and we'll restart the session after our 10-minute break is up. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes' time.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had an opportunity to maybe do a quick stretch, get a coffee or tea or water, so we can finish up with the next two modules. So up to now, we've outlined the TNFD recommendations and guidance and how they can support our activities and assess and manage those nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. But now let's look a bit more at the practical implications. So to break this unit down, we're going to cover three topics that are key to progressing action on nature, considering where to start in assessing nature-related issues, then delving into the TNFD's LEAP approach that can support this, and then we'll finish with a practice case study again from our guest speakers at S&P to bring this to life. So to kick us off in this unit, let's firstly look at the steps that organizations just can take to get started. And I think that relates to a lot of the questions we've been getting. Now, first, I want to help you understand a bit better what it means to embed nature into an organization's processes. So to successfully embed nature into our corporate processes, we must begin by changing our mindset. The starting point needs to be a clear understanding that nature is essential to our business. It's not just an environmental concern, it really underpins everything from our supply chains to our long-term stability. Now, once we acknowledge that fundamental importance, we need to get really granular. We must delve deeper into what the specific dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities are that truly affect our specific organization. What exactly do we rely on? What is the exact effect we're seeing? And where do the resulting risks and opportunities lie? Then these critical insights can be used for the next steps in integrating it into our existing risk management and strategy development process. So if a nature risk is financially material, it must inform our strategy just the way any other financially material risk, such as a market risk, would. So to achieve this integration, we need really broad buy-in and action. So an organizational-wide approach is absolutely required. I want to be clear, this is not just a sustainability issue. It involves finance, operations, product design, procurement, etc. So therefore, we really need to identify the teams and the business areas that must contribute to this work and own the outcomes across the company. Now, finally, at the very bottom of that iceberg, successful execution really requires structure and accountability. So we must establish initial governance over nature to help guide and drive these actions consistently throughout the business. And this governance structure is what will ensure we move from assessment to impactful, lasting change. So the disclosure and action you eventually report are really just that tip of the iceberg on top there. All the crucial foundational work we've just discussed, the identification, the integration, the governance, and organization-wide engagement, this is the massive amount of the iceberg under the water. So to get started on this, I think it's important to bring together the right people throughout the organization, and this can sometimes have its challenges. So let's hear how Patrick has dealt with those challenges at Swire Properties.
We found the most effective way is to ground the conversation in the fundamental principles of business continuity and value creation. And we start with a simple, provocative question. Could we operate our building portfolio or construct a new one if we lost reliable access to stable temperatures, a stable supply of water, or resilient supply chains for materials like concrete and steel? This immediately makes the abstract concept of nature very tangible and urgent. We then connect the dots to the specific roles. For example, to our finance and development teams, we explain that nature-related risks are factors that can directly impact construction cost, capital expenditure, and asset valuation. To our facility management team, we discuss how healthy green space would actually help improve the microclimate. To our procurement team, we can actually frame it as a supply chain resilience issue, where a drought in a certain region that producing steel could actually delay the projects and inflate the cost. So by translating dependencies and impacts into the language of operational risk and financial performance, we are more successful to move the conversation from why we should do this to how we can afford not to. So this practical and business-centric framing has been very instrumental in helping us to secure engagement across the company.
Great. So wonderful to hear in practice, there we go, in practice, how Patrick has dealt with this and really coming back to that framing and how we're discussing this and bringing it back to the real effects on your company. So we're going to do another poll here. It should pop up on your screen now. This is just to hear from you again, how familiar you are with the LEAP approach. Maybe you have no idea what this means, and that's no problem. You can just say, I've not heard of it. But maybe you're already using the LEAP approach, and maybe you're not using it, but you have heard of it and you know what LEAP stands for. I'm just going to give a moment just to get a sense of the stage you're all at, because we're going to go into this approach and discuss how you can use that to really get started on this topic. Now, I see a strong familiarity, which is great. So I'm going to end the poll and show the results here. And you can see that a lot of you are familiar with it. So nearly half of you, almost half of you are either using it or familiar with it. But over half of you, 54% of you, have not heard of the term LEAP before. So don't worry, we're going to dive into that. There's 30 of you that filled in the questionnaire that are using it already. So we do want to hear from you. Participate in this workshop and share with us your experience and how you found using LEAP. Now, before we move into an activity, let me first introduce it. So the LEAP, as you can see, stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. But before you get into locate and the rest of LEAP, there's a first kind of scoping phase, which is really important. Here, we really want to understand a clear understanding of the nature-related issues that are both relevant and material for your business. And we want to start with who needs to work on this. So the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures recommends using this LEAP approach as a starting point to really build that understanding. And as with all their materials, it's really meant to be flexible and iterative. So you use it how best it works with your organization. But it starts first off with a scoping phase, which is helping to, as I said, understand from the outset this issue, the potential cost, the time, the data, the restraints. After that initial scoping phase, we move into locate, which is locating your organization's interface with nature. So where do your operations, value chain, and other activities interact with the ecosystems? Then evaluate, where you evaluate your dependencies and your impacts on nature. How does nature support your business, and how does your business affect nature? Then assess is looking at your nature-related risks and opportunities that arise from these dependencies and impacts. And prepare is responding to it, reporting on it, your material nature-related issues, aligning them with the TNFD recommended disclosures. So LEAP actually builds on existing frameworks like the Natural Capital Protocol and Science-Based Targets and Network SBTN methods. But importantly, let's remember that engagement is an important cross-cutting, oops, sorry, I went too far there. There we go. Engagement is a really important cross-cutting component of the LEAP approach, informing all phases. So if you already have a nature assessment process, you can use LEAP as sort of a checklist to ensure it aligns with TNFD's recommended disclosures. But crucially, you don't have to disclose everything identified through LEAP when it comes time for disclosure. You will only apply the chosen materiality lens for that. Now, let's come back to Patrick just for a quick moment to see how they've been using LEAP.
Before our TNFD journey, we had a general awareness of our nature impact, but we were less aware about the scale and complexity of our nature-related dependencies and impacts embedded within our global supply chain. The structured LEAP approach, as recommended by TNFD, was very important in improving our understanding through a science-based and data-driven approach. During the locate and evaluate phase, we systematically mapped our material sourcing geographies for selected high nature impact commodities like concrete and steel. And this revealed that our impact on nature extends thousands of miles from our construction sites. And we discovered that actually a staggering 95% of our sector's impact on nature is actually embedded upstream in the supply chain. And this was a very important revelation. The framework was pivotal in moving us from a vague concept of supply chain risk to a concrete and somewhat startling realization. The environmental health of a distant quarry or watershed is directly related to our own construction project stability and profitability. We now understand that a drought halting that will halt, for example, impacting the aggregate production or a new regulation on mineral extraction, they are tangible threats to actually our construction timelines and budgets. And TNFD provided the necessary lens for us to see that our most significant nature-related risks are actually throughout our entire value chain, making the resilience of distant ecosystem actually a matter of our own operational resilience.
Great. So now we can see how Patrick and his company use that in practice. And I think that's helpful just for, oops, sorry, Fiona. I'm going to stop touching the slides. I'll let you get it to where it needs to be. And I'm going to pass back to Fiona, actually. So our two Fionas, Fiona from the SSE and Fiona from TNFD, are going to now put this into practice and take you through an exercise. So I'll pass over to you guys.
Great, thanks for that, Tiffany. So as we said, we know that the key place to get started here is really assessing what those nature-related issues are for your organization. And as introduced by Tiffany there, the main way that we'd really recommend doing that is using the LEAP approach. So we've already heard a little bit about what LEAP is, but now we're going to work through an exercise together in Menti, because, instead of us just explaining this slide by slide, we think that the best way to learn this process is really to have a go at it together. So we're going to be recreating a simplified approach to conducting a LEAP assessment ourselves by pretending that we're part of the internal assessment team of a fictitious company called FastBite. And so by the end of this exercise, we hope that you'll know the approach better than if we'd potentially just presented it to you. So let's go back into Menti now. Thanks, Tiffany, for resharing that link, and I'll reshare on my screen as well the other ways that you can join us in Menti. I'll just put the QR code there on the side of the screen so that you have access to that. If you need to join us in Menti, as a reminder, you've got the QR code, you've got the link in the chat, and you've got that menti.com page and then the 8-number code there. So whichever way you choose to join us, please do come into the exercise. It's great to get your input to this. So as I've said, our aim really is to understand the 4 components of LEAP and the scoping stages as well, and to hopefully help you to see how flexible and iterative this methodology is. So just to say up front, what we're going to do now is a simplified way to get the understanding of some of the basics. It's not necessarily going to be a full and comprehensive overview of all of the nuances of LEAP, but we're going to signpost resources to you at the end of this section where you can learn more about this. So as a quick recap, Tiffany's already talked us through these different phases of LEAP that we see on the screen here, and a few reminders. So LEAP is designed to be undertaken by an internal assessment team. So for the purposes of this assessment, we're going to ask you to put yourselves of being in the shoes of that internal team conducting a LEAP assessment. And the method is designed to be used by both corporates and financial institutions. But in today's exercise, we'll start by putting ourselves in a company's footprints to understand it from that view. If you're a financial institution, you might want to also think about how you could assess the same things at a portfolio level, but there's some further resources available in the slides to help you understand better those differences. So with that clarified up front, let's introduce our company that we'll work through as our hypothetical example today. So FastBite is a major public listed US fast food chain. They sell, hamburgers, fries, and shakes, and they operate across the US. So it's an important part of their success to have a consistent and high quality year-round supply of beef, potatoes, wheat, and dairy. And they have a large and complex supply chain sourcing their products from both parts of the US and other parts of the Americas as well, across North and South. They've already started to experience a number of risks in recent years relating to nature. They've seen disruptions and rising costs in their supply chain because they've had extreme weather events, invasive pests, and degradation of their pastures, affecting the ability to secure the inputs they need for their business. And they've also seen some issues relating to pressure from media and NGOs and even their customers because of potential links between their activities and key Brazilian beef suppliers who are impacting on issues of deforestation in sensitive parts of the Amazon. And they ultimately, at the moment, don't have a good way of tracking those issues. And so, to help them build their strategic responses to these issues and also to understand if there are other risks potentially that they need to address, they decide to undertake their first LEAP assessment. With an ultimate aim of improving how they can manage these things and understanding how they can adapt their business model in the future. So the first stage, as we've already discussed in this process for FastBite, will be to scope their LEAP assessment. And so as a reminder, the scoping stage is all around getting a shared understanding and alignment internally on the scope of the assessment and the resources that may be needed for it. So let's firstly start by asking ourselves, if FastBite wanted to understand how it interacts with nature, which of these aspects do you think that they would need to consider? So in Menti, you've got a multiple choice option here to select as many of these as you think are relevant. And I think you've got a number of sort of tokens that you can vote with. So maybe you want to spread those out to say which of the issues you think are relevant. Maybe you want to use them to highlight in particular which you think are the most important. Maybe you put the most votes towards which you think is the key element here at the scoping stage. So keep in mind when you're thinking about this that maybe all of these elements will be relevant at some point, but which do you think are most important to think about for scoping in particular when you're just getting started and thinking about the right resources and approach to this assessment? Okay, thanks everyone who's already voted here. It looks like we think a lot of these elements are important, but maybe the key one I see is mapping the value chain. I think a lot of you are answering that option. A good split across maybe understanding the data, thinking about timelines, gathering data as well. So I think the thing we would say here is that a lot of these are really going to be quite relevant to consider indeed for scoping. So a lot of these are correct. The only one we would say probably doesn't belong in scoping would be to gather detailed data on the locations, because actually that's probably more information that you would need than for the scoping stage. That's something you're going to come to later in the assessment when you get into locate. So no need to gather detailed data when you're scoping, but important to think about all of these other aspects. I'll turn to you here, Fiona, as well. Is there anything maybe you'd contribute in terms of what you'd recommend for companies at the scoping stage?
Sure, thanks, Fiona. Absolutely. When scoping, organizations should really consider being flexible and really open to change. For organizations that completed a pilot, we found that they rarely ended their assessment with the exact same scope with which they started. It's obviously extremely true also, as you noted, when organizations start with an incredibly detailed scope. They find that they cannot retain that level of detail based on a number of challenges they might encounter as part of the assessment process, which might, pertain to sort of limitations or challenges with accessing data. Also just some capability challenges, realizing they might not have the necessary skills. So basically, the takeaway is to start high level early on and avoid jumping into detailed analysis too soon. And another sort of key takeaway is to also secure sort of internal buy-in and get senior management approval, alignment early on in the process. It's really great to have this process championed internally, and also to think about setting up early on a diverse team of people. So not only having, the sustainability team involved, but also thinking about data teams or risk teams, so that they can feed into the process and bring their perspectives into the process and help respond to challenges, but also provide this diverse perspective and end up with a robust assessment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Fiona. I think some really good advice for companies there in getting started. So, in a nutshell, these are the key things then that we'd recommend that organizations consider at the scoping stage. So, let's move on now and think about what FastBite would think about in the next stage, which is locate. So, as a reminder, locate is all about starting to identify the potentially material nature-related issues that a company should focus its assessment on. So, really starting to zone in on what the issues are that are going to be the focus of the assessment. So one key thing that will form a part of that is mapping the value chain and thinking about the operating locations of the organization and its key partners in its value chain. So to help us get started with this, our next question to think about is, which of these business activities would you be expecting to be present within FastBite's operations or its value chain? So we've heard a little bit about them as an organization and the parts of the world they operate in and what they do. Which of these elements do you think would be relevant parts of the value chain? You may think more than one is. You can vote for as many of these again as you think are relevant. So there's no right or wrong answers here, we should say. Of course, we're just trying to put ourselves in the shoes of being FastBite and think about the fact that this is something that they need to consider. So feel free to just apply that and think what you think most sense. So thanks everyone for voting. It's great to see lots of input. So we see crop production and animal production as the top ones. I think that's very logical that, of course, because that's their core business, to sell food, then of course these two things are going to be really key elements of their value chain and the inputs. I'm seeing waste collection, treatment or disposal as popular answer as well. Of course, from their direct operations, they're likely to generate a lot of waste and probably across the value chain as well. And that's something that will need to be dealt with downstream of their organization too. So indeed, very relevant. And then many of you have highlighted possibly that the others could be relevant too. And I think that's probably highlights the key message here, because we know that it's often easy to see immediately what our direct operations are, or perhaps which activities link to our core products. But maybe there are other elements here that could be present depending on how the business operates. So, for example, real estate may depend on the extent to which FastBite operates its own assets. Does it lease properties? Those kinds of things. Is there a franchising arrangement? So the precise nature of how real estate comes into this will come down to that. Similarly, questions of how the energy is produced upstream of its business or how goods are transported may be questions that the assessment team need to go away and ask their colleagues about, so that they understand which of those different activities are relevant for them. And really, that's one of the key things that you would be doing in the locate stage. So I think in the interest of time, I'll move us on now to evaluate, Fiona, but we can talk a bit more in that segment. So in evaluate then, we've identified which aspects we're going to be focusing the assessments on. The purpose then is to identify potentially material nature-related issues that we're going to focus in on. So we've identified those different value chain activities, and now let's think about what their connection is to nature. So we'll look at a few of the activities that we thought in that assessment just there may be the most likely to be associated with nature-related impacts and dependencies. And our next question for you then is to think about how much do you think FastBite's business activities potentially would impact or rely upon nature in these different areas. So this is just a simple version of what this might look like. Of course, you might want to do something a bit more nuanced in the evaluate stage within your organization, but you can use the sliding scale here to rank each issue or activity. And so you use the two scales there to say how much do you think that the organization would impact nature through that activity, and then how much do you think they would rely upon or depend upon inputs from nature in order to allow them to do that. So, of course, don't worry about getting this exactly right, but just take a few moments to have a think about what you think this could look at. So I'm seeing already lots of answers coming in. Do have a go if you haven't done already. It might help us to get a better spread of what you're thinking if more of us answer. You may think differently to people who've answered so far. That's okay. Part of the process with your colleagues here would really be to discuss why you think this and think about the relevant evidence that you could draw on to help you conduct this assessment. But so far, I think it looks like, just look on my screen a bit bigger over here, that animal and crop production are probably both the highest reliance and some of the highest impacts. Maybe we think that marine transportation would be something they're less reliant and maybe have a slightly lower impact as well. So that just gives us a view of how we could start to map this out and discuss with our colleagues how we could better understand this. But Fiona, I know you might have a few thoughts that you could chip in here as well about what perhaps some of the typical impacts and dependencies could be across some of these areas.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. So just focusing on sort of the highly material ones that have been rated. So looking at like activities like crop production and animal production, there might be high dependence, very high dependence on water supply for irrigation, as well as soil quality and pollination services. And then in terms of high dependencies for animal production, similarly also very dependent on soil quality, obviously depending on healthy and fertile soils to provide production of animal feed, and dependencies on the provision of biomass, for example, for grazing cattle, and also water supply. So similar dependencies. And then when we think about impacts, we'll find increasing or highly material impacts on land use, obviously converting land for crops or for raising cattle, as well as a very high materiality for water use and yeah, mostly water use. I'll leave it there.
Sure. Thanks, Fiona. I know there's so much we could dig into on this topic, but great to highlight a few of the key ones for everyone there. So thanks very much. So what we've just done here in LEAP and the evaluate stage, sorry, is think about really what those dependencies and impacts are. You know, the depth that you do at this stage will potentially depend on how many times you've looked at this topic before. You might want to iterate it. So maybe a high level starting point such as this could be a good base to move forward from and build out some understanding over time. And so after evaluate, the next step for FastBite will be to think about prioritizing within this evaluate activity, it's identified the different impacts and dependencies, but the other part of evaluate that's important will be to prioritize which of them it thinks is most material. So we won't go into that now, but just to say that's also an important thing here once you've identified those dependencies and impacts. But moving on to talk about our next stage of assess. So the purpose here is then to think about the risks and opportunities related to those dependencies and impacts. So this is all about thinking about what is financially material for the organization and what it needs to disclose. So we've already heard in our training today about a number of different types of nature-related risk and opportunity. So you can learn more about this in the TNFD's materials, but just as a quick reminder on some of the key types of risk and opportunity. So firstly, we've got physical risks, which are kind of direct threats caused by changes in state of nature. So these could be both chronic things, for example, maybe water scarcity, but they could also be acute events such as a coastal flooding event, for example. We also have transition risks as well. So these are threats arising from society's responses to nature. So those could be things like policy changes, maybe shifting customer demands for sustainable products, or maybe reputational risks. And then finally, we have systemic risks as well. So risks that come about from the overall breakdown of natural systems, which can cascade across markets. So, for example, the collapse of a key ecosystem service like pollination. We won't talk about opportunities at this point, but just to say it's important to recognize that there are potential opportunities as well for businesses relating to enhanced business performance, and also opportunities to contribute to nature positive outcomes as well. So it's important to be thinking about and assessing those too. But to help us get started on this, we'll think particularly about risks today. And so our question for you now is to look at a couple of different possible nature-related risks that we think could be relevant for FastBite, and to have a go at ranking these risks based on the scale there from a low or a high risk. So try to use the scale in relative terms. You may agree that all of these are relevant, but which do you think is maybe the highest ranked risk? Which do you think would be the lowest ranked risk? And this will be really what you'll be aiming to do as part of the assess phase. So to characterize what those business specific risks and opportunities are, and then to rank those. And you might use a more sophisticated scale than this. This is just a simple way to do it together today. But you might, of course, want to go away and evaluate, severity and likelihood, maybe embedding this more into the language that you're using in your organization's existing risk processes. But looking at those risks we've got on the screen, I see lots of you have highlighted soil degradation as maybe one of the key risks you think could be relevant for them, because that could impact, of course, on the availability of its food stocks. Perhaps you think that technology change risk may not be as significant for them, or maybe changes in regulations, perhaps not significant at the moment. So thanks for having a go there. Fiona, I'll turn to you as well for a quick thought here as well. Just let's keep it quick perhaps, but if there are any thoughts maybe you'd have, anything that you'd add about what participants could think about in this segment.
Yeah, there's often close relationships between different types of nature-related risk, and physical and transition risk often interact with each other, so important to remember. An example is that FastBite might be exposed to acute physical risk by its choice of suppliers and their connection to activities such as deforestation. And in turn, these activities might drive more chronic risks like soil degradation that increases exposure to chronic risk. And in turn, it might also drive transition risks through policy or legal risks or reputational risks if this is perceived negatively by its customers. Just learning from pilot testers that organizations should consider and remember to use a range of methods and tools to support their assessment and get familiar with the benefits and limitations of those tools. But that really helps them through this process, and especially identifying their nature-related risks. So overall, just the assess phase is really about understanding which nature-related risks are financially material to an organization. And helps organizations to understand how to integrate these risks into their existing management processes. So we're really trying not to reinvent the wheel, but support and use existing tools. Back over to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Fiona. Lots of good advice there, definitely. Okay, so we're going to move to look at prepare now, but before I move off this slide, I'd invite you maybe just to think about which of these risks you thought was the highest significance risk, and maybe carry that through into the next phase of the training that we'll move into here. So here in prepare, we're thinking about how the organization should respond to these nature-related issues that it's identified. So really building its response to the individual issues it's identified, but also building its organizational-wide approach to how to report these issues, how to embed them into risk management and its strategy. So the final question we have as part of this exercise for you is to think about what's one action that FastBite could take to respond to or mitigate some of those nature-related risks that we've identified. So as I've said, you might want to think about the key risk that you thought was most significant for them here and think about a mitigation for that risk. You might want to think about something more holistic you think that they should do across their business or their approach to this to think about these issues more generally. But have a go at thinking about a response or a mitigation that FastBite could potentially think about implementing here. Of course, you may think of many, so that's okay. Feel free to just share one or two thoughts that come to mind. So great, lots of good answers already. So someone has mentioned using LEAP, of course, so that will continue to help them to understand these issues better. So thinking about diversifying their suppliers, maybe training farmers in their supply chain on sustainable agricultural methods. That's a fantastic potential option, I think. Someone thinks that maybe marine transport would be a really big risk, and so something they should perhaps zone their focus on. Exactly, that could be relevant, depending on, of course, the assessment and what comes out of it. Someone's mentioned looking again with suppliers at regenerative practices and thinking about water management, indeed. So lots of thoughts on engaging with suppliers. That may indeed come out as the key risk here, that reliance they have on suppliers who are managing these issues in terms of both the impacts and dependencies on nature to grow crops and rear livestock. So definitely, I think, a key hotspot that they're likely to want to take forward. Some people are mentioning maybe broadening the meat supply, so they could think again about other sources. They might want to think as well, of course, about maybe increasing their range of plant-based products to even reduce reliance on meat suppliers, or also, of course, potentially reduce impact if they can move to more plant-based protein options. Great. I think lots of you kind of echoing the same points here, but I think, of course, this is a really key one. Some other things they might want to think about is to scan a little bit more for the policies that could impact them in different markets. So we didn't necessarily highlight policy and regulatory change as a key risk, but maybe they need to think about their readiness. I know in many markets, there's increasing requirements around due diligence of your suppliers. So they have already said they don't have good traceability there, and that might be a risk if they don't start to implement things ahead of legal requirements coming in there. And of course, as well, another thing to think about here is that there's lots of things that they would want to do, and they may need to prioritize how they implement these actions, thinking about, a hierarchy of approaches. So starting by, of course, making sure that you avoid negative practices and try to mitigate and reduce impacts, moving over time towards methods that are really restorative and that aim to improve ecosystem recovery, but starting with the basics of ensuring that negative impacts are minimized or eliminated where possible. Great. I'll just turn back to you, Fiona, before we close out here to see if there's any final points you'd advise people to think about in Prepare.
Yeah, so Prepare's about responding to identified dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, but it's also thinking about reporting and getting ready to report. So just a key takeaway to remember that climate and nature are interconnected, and it's therefore really important to take an integrated approach to reporting. And this is something we'll cover in a little bit more detail further down in this presentation. But just also generally, as an encouraging, I suppose, takeaway is to start with the data you already have. Many pilot testers were surprised by the data they already had available, they had mapped out. So really get started with what you've got. You'd be surprised. I'll hand back to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I think lots of really good advice there. And as you say, hopefully an encouragement for anyone who might be feeling that this is a little overwhelming. We hope that stepping through it together with a practical company example has helped us to understand a little bit better what could sit within these stages. So we've used FastBite to help us understand that. Of course, FastBite we picked as reasonably obvious kind of nature-related dependencies and impacts. For your organization, it may not be quite so obvious, however. For example, if you're more in a services-based sector, possibly it's only when you really get into mapping out your value chain in Locate that you'll actually discover what activities exist that interface with nature. And so that's where we'd really encourage you to just get started with thinking about the LEAP approach to help you to uncover what those issues are. So let me return to the slide presentation now, and we'll pick up where we were in the slides. Thanks for everyone for giving such great input to that as well. It's always great for us to get lots of engagement, so thank you. So we've given you that understanding of what LEAP is, and we're going to turn now to a few more practical tools and takeaways about how you can use LEAP in your own organizations. And so one thing you may already be starting to think about is what are the different tools, data sets that you could draw on to help you work through that assessment. So I'll just give you a quick overview of some of the key tools on this topic. There are many out there. And then I'm going to be bringing in Yusuf from S&P, who's going to talk to us in particular about the tools that S&P offer and how they're using those to support companies. I'll just see if I can get the slides to wake up. There we go. Oh, skipped a bit ahead. So the first one is just to give you a quick overview of some of the key tools and resources. So there's a wide range out there, depending on which issue you're trying to assess, what sector you operate in, maybe whether you're a financial institution or a company. One thing is just to say that there's a TNFD tools catalog available, which gives you a overview of all of the different tools that are out there. So encourage you to take a look at that catalog. There's no single way to use these tools and data. All organizations are different, but really it's important just to think about matching the tool to your maturity level and to the issue that you're looking to assess. And there's an extra slide in your handout here, which gives you some additional factors that you might want to consider to help you select the right tool for your use case. But moving into a few specific examples and tools and data sets that exist for companies and investors. So we're going to hear from S&P in a moment about their work, but they've developed a global nature and biodiversity data set and a nature risk platform. And that builds upon the nature risk profile method that they developed in partnership with UNEP-FI, and really designed to support companies, investors, and entities to understand and manage these issues. And another interesting tool to explore would potentially be Robeco's biodiversity risk traffic light. So this RIN is designed to assess corporate positioning on biodiversity, and that enables investors to understand leaders and laggards in this space and how different companies are doing. And maybe if you're a company as well, you can look at that tool to see how your investors might currently be looking at you and understanding your actions and understanding where you should prioritize efforts to improve. And then finally, we've got the WWF Biodiversity Risk Filter, which is a free online tool designed to help both companies and financial institutions as well. So this is designed to assess 3 different types of biodiversity-related business risk: physical risks, regulatory risks, and reputational ones. So just 3 examples really of a lot of the tools that are out there in the market and which organizations are already using to better understand nature-related risks and opportunities and potentially assess their own partners, investees, and suppliers as well. I'm now going to pass you over to Yusuf from S&P, who's going to take us through an example of how one company approached the assessment of nature-related risks using LEAP, leveraging the S&P's available tools. So over to you, Yusuf, and I'll just give you the slide control.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, so now that we understood what LEAP is theoretically, and we went through an exercise, we will work through a practical case study of an actual company that went through the LEAP assessment. So I don't explain this again. I think we're reasonably familiar with the phases. And now we're just working our way through. And let me introduce to you first the case example here. And that is the first time LEAP assessment for a company which was a global petrochemicals company with more than $10 billion in revenue. And they have more than 30 production facilities globally. And why did they want to do a LEAP assessment? Well, they wanted to get ahead of the upcoming regulatory requirements, especially the EU CSRD, and just simply to understand their own risks, right? So to support their risk management. And step 0 essentially is the scoping phase. So this is sometimes skipped, but it's kind of important to have a mutual understanding where you start the assessment. And what we decided upon was to focus on the own operations of this company first, right? Upstream is difficult. They source a lot of commodities such as crude oil. And that's why, it's not so clear how you assess the nature impacts there. We did look at one upstream pipeline, but that's about it. Downstream was also out of scope. The company produces a lot of plastics that has, many different use cases. And so this is also postponed to a later step. It's important to understand, and I think that was already explained, this is not a one shot. You have to start somewhere and you cannot start with everything. So the choice was to start primarily with the company's own operations. Now, in step 1 or phase 1, we have the locate phase, and that means locate interface with nature. And so what we do here is we look at the asset, right? So the company has about 30 assets, and we look here for, to demonstrate it at one of them. And so this is an ethylene production, and it's in the US. It's in the biome temperate coniferous forest. And so what we do is we map out the asset. So we look at it on a map, we draw the perimeter around it with GPS and the polygon mapping. And that already tells us a couple of things. So first of all, we identified here in this step, there's no overlap with a key biodiversity area or a world protected area. So from the world database of protected areas. We also know that the facility has a water intake from the river and from groundwater for cooling purposes. The potential impacts are due to chemical pollution or microplastics to the surrounding areas. And there is just basically land use. So land use for storage, infrastructure, tanks, piping, and all the facilities. So this is step one. Now we move into the next phase, which is the evaluate phase. And here we ask ourselves a couple of questions. We want to understand the impacts and the dependencies. So how do we do this? Well, we look at the impact side at three different things. So first of all, the footprint. That is how large is the asset, then the ecological significance, and then the environmental degradation. Specifically, we ask ourselves for the footprint, what is the land use of these operations and the land use change? For the ecological significance, we look at how important is this piece of land and the area for species, but also how important is it to people and their economic activity and well-being. And lastly, how degraded is this piece of land, this environment? So that's the impact side. And then we look at the dependency side. And here it's a little bit different. We look at the individual ecosystem services, of which there are more than 20. And we see a couple of them here, such as groundwater availability, pollination, climate regulation. And for each of them, we ask ourselves, how relevant is this ecosystem service for my operations? And how vulnerable is this ecosystem service at this location? So it's very important we look at this not just theoretically, but in this location where the asset is. Now, the output of such a phase could be something like this, right? So these are some of the metrics that we compute. And for this asset here, we have on the one hand, a bunch of metrics on the impact side, but also on the dependency side. On the impacts, we have the footprint, and then metrics that I explained before, the degradation and the significance. And so what sticks out to me is that the ecosystem significance is elevated here. And why is that? Was not because of significance to species, but more because of significance to people. The ecosystem contribution, 0.45 in our metric here, that's elevated. On the dependency side, you also see various ecosystem services. Some are not relevant to this company. So for a chemical facility, something like pollination will not be relevant, but others are. And one of them that sticks out is, for example, water quality. So it's important that there is high water quality for the operations of this company. And now we move into phase 3, which is the assess phase. And we use the outputs of the prior phase as inputs here. So we look at the top impacts and dependencies that we identified in the prior phase. And then we ask ourselves, what are the resulting risks and opportunities from those impacts and dependencies? Okay. And we go through all the top impacts and dependencies. So let me give you an example here. When we look at this impact to surrounding communities, we saw before impact to people, that's something that could be a real issue here. Then we figure out what could actually happen with this asset based on where exactly it is and what the operations are of this asset. And so in this case, we identify that effluent discharge of substances of concern over the limit are an issue. So basically toxic wastewater that could be impacting local communities and fisheries. So that's a clear risk. Or a second one could be that there are air emissions that are settling on local farmland. And so now we need to assess those risks. And we do this by ideally leveraging existing systems and frameworks that the company already uses and that are embedded in the enterprise risk management. So for example, when we look at toxic wastewater here, the first one, what could happen? Well, there could be an enforced shutdown if the pollutant thresholds are exceeded. And so they need to stop operations and fix it. And that could be a big financial impact. And so here, ideally, this is aligned with the corporate enterprise risk management thresholds. So for example, a company could assess something that is, below $10,000 could be a 1 out of 5. Then up to $1 million, it's a 3 out of 5. And then if it's over $1 billion in damages, it's a 5 out of 5. But these thresholds have to, of course, be adjusted to firm size. So for a smaller company, the limits are lower. But this is just one way to do it, right? It's not the only way to do it, but that's a classic risk management approach. You could also have, as another risk, community protests and reputational loss. Here you could define it differently. So for example, a 1 out of 5 is basically nothing. A 3 out of 5 is a national news story. And a 5 out of 5 could be something that is a long-lasting global news story. And yeah, lastly, we could have, for example, here regulatory tightening, so stricter permit limits and higher compliance costs. Okay, so that will also be a cost factor. Now, these risks you want to assess systematically and in close collaboration between the risk management experts of your company and site level experts. The risk management experts know the methodology and the company processes, and the site level experts, they really know what's going on the ground. Let's go through another example. We also identified that dependence on water quality is a high issue. So what could happen if there isn't high water quality? Well, a resulting risk here could be that the asset integrity is negatively impacted, so that my machines break down when the water quality that is coming in is not high enough. I could have reduced process reliability or a lower yield, or I could have increased operational costs. Maybe I need to put in an extra step for filtration. And so again, I go through the risk assessment here. For example, when we talk about the asset integrity, impurities that are the result of the low water quality could create corrosion in certain spare parts, and those spare parts need to be replaced more frequently. It is a financial impact, maybe not the highest one, okay? So you have just a bit more spare parts use. The bigger risk here is you have an unplanned shutdown or a cleanup and repair costs due to a leakage. So that would be really bad. And that would come with a financial impact. If you have to stop operations, it's typically bad. And it comes with a reputational impact. So that would be the assessment here. And again, this is something you want to understand together between risk management and site level experts. And so now, once we figured that out, we can bring this all back to the enterprise risk management register. So for example, the ERM here, you have a bunch of risks already in there, such as operational risks, business risks, market risks, and you can bring in the important biodiversity and nature risks here. So for example, we identified low water quality, which is impacting equipment integrity, is a big risk that we want to monitor. And so what that means now is we want to define a risk management approach. For example, maybe we need to update our policies, or if we didn't have one before, we could write a new policy, such as a water resource management policy. Certain actions to be taken. We could upgrade the filtration systems to deal with the bad water quality, or we could install particle sensors so that we know when the water quality is particularly bad. Then we can define metrics that we want to measure going forward. So for example, water quality metrics. So how dirty is the water? Or we could look at asset integrity metrics. So we could look at erosion rates at certain critical points of the equipment. And once we've figured that out, last step is to disclose. And that means disclosing it in the TNFD logic, which simply means the governance. So who is responsible for overseeing and managing a certain risk? The strategy, which is describing what the risk is and how it potentially impacts me and my value chain. The risk management approach, so how do I identify, assess, and manage risks? And lastly, the metrics and targets. We've mentioned some here before. How do you measure risk going forward? What targets are you setting yourself to address the risks? And so that's pretty much end to end a first time Leap adopter approach. And of course, going forward, you mature in this area, you maybe extend the value chain upward or downward that you want to observe and include more metrics. But practically speaking, that's a great start already.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joseph. I think as we're seeing from the thumbs up, I think people really appreciated that walkthrough as well. So big thanks for taking us through that. Great. So just to wrap up this segment then, we're going to just ask you one poll question now. We've heard from Joseph there a bit of an overview on different aspects of how to approach the phases of LEAP, and we also thought about that with our FastBite example. So maybe what would be interesting to know would be, from what you've heard so far, which of these areas do you think would potentially be the most challenging for your organization? And if you want to share why you've selected that in the chat, feel free to do so as well. We'll just let those responses come in for a moment, but Joseph and Fiona as well, if you're happy to join us, it'd be interesting maybe just as we're wrapping up this segment, just to see maybe what your thoughts would be on organizations, what the answers are here and what your recommendations would be for companies to address those challenges. So I'd encourage people to share in the chat if there's a particular reason why you think a particular stage would be challenging. It looks like Evaluate is coming out at the poll, the top one so far as maybe the most difficult. So I'll share the results there so we can see those. So a third of you have said evaluate, so that's interesting. I see also you've had someone share in the chat as well that they think prepare could be quite difficult as well. So maybe thinking about how to quantify the financial aspects in particular being a key challenge. So yeah, maybe I'll come to you first, Joseph. Is there any reflections there on those common challenges that you hear, and maybe what would you recommend for organizations to address some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, that evaluate and assess comes out on top is quite typical. So I would say evaluate here is the number one. There's so many different ways to do this. I mean, we have tried to address it with our tools, but there are more out there. I think it's just to get a baseline and a good understanding of what are potentially your impacts and dependencies. Maybe start with just the impacts. Maybe just start with just the dependencies. You start somewhere where you feel like it's most pressing. We heard before, you probably have more data than you think that you can also use. So it's probably just important to get started somehow, right? And don't be intimidated. And the assess is more like, yeah, it's good if you have a good risk management approach already. And ideally it ties into that. I see that financial impact is usually a tough one, but it's the same for a lot of those risk management practices. Same with CSRD, if you have to quantify social impacts. So that's why it's more you try to use as much data as you can, but also at some point it's in the worst case, it's a consensus decisions with internal and external experts and more ranges or is it low, medium, high, more or less. Even that is already something that you can start with.
Great. Thanks, Joseph. I think that's some good advice for sure. And Fiona, maybe coming to you, I see we've had lots of answers coming in the chat with people sharing their context. Might be too many to have read them all, but is there anything in particular you'd highlight from what you're seeing reflected there about any advice you'd share?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona, and totally echo what Joseph has said today. So thanks for the presentation, by the way. I would definitely, echo what was said. So just start with what you have, the data that you have. As we already said, you might be surprised by the quantity of data that might be available to you. Thinking about sort of quantification and measure, while it can be daunting, we have a host of guidance that can help you through the process. And we also have a number of case studies and use cases on how TNFD has been, or the LEAP approach has been applied. And so I would invite all of you to go and explore those case studies to better understand and put yourselves in the shoes of other organizations who might have gone through the process. And just taking a step back in terms of just getting started generally, thinking about, deepening your understanding of nature as a first step, really familiarizing yourself with the content. Again, making that internal case making that internal business case to have nature sort of championed internally. Starting with what you have, as we said, planning for progression over time. So starting really small, as we mentioned in the scoping phase, you can start with a small scope and expand over time as the TNFD recognizes some of the challenges that you might encounter in terms of data collection and access, and just monitor and evaluate your progress over time. So yeah, just a few takeaways. I'll hand back to you.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. Lots of good tips there. Big thanks to you both, and thanks, Yusuf, for the presentation. I'll just highlight as well, Yusuf, I think we've had one question sort of directed at you in the Q&A, which I think you're already typing to, so I'll let you get back to them. But thanks for joining us, much appreciated. Excellent. So I'll just wrap us up quickly on this segment. So we're at the end of module 3 of 4 now. So well done, everyone, for staying with us this far. And we'll be moving into our final module shortly. But just to wrap up here, we talked in this module about how to kickstart internal action on this, and that really thinking at the outset about how to take an integrated and holistic approach is key. So thinking from that perspective is a really important starting point, because it's going to build the right foundation for you to really embed these issues and support your company's long-term strategic resilience. And then as well, we also then moved into, oh, excuse me, just think we're getting a bit of slide movement. I'll just remind panelists just to be careful you're not hitting any keys there. So just going into the second point there, which, as I said, was introducing the LEAP approach. So we then gave you that overview of the 4 phases of LEAP. And really, this is the recommended starting point to really understand what these issues are for your organization. And as we talked about, this is designed to be flexible and iterative. So that is really what that, I'll just take away slide control because it looks like someone is accidentally moving it. Sorry about that, everyone. And so the final thing just to highlight here, of course, is that there is a lot out there that can help you on this. So lots of different data, tools, case studies of companies that have conducted a LEAP assessment available on the TNFD website. So be sure to check all of those resources out. So that brings us now into the last module, and I'll pass you back over to Tiffany, who's going to get us started on this one.
Hi, Fiona. Thanks very much. Was just trying to reply to a few of the Q&A in chat. But we're at the last module. So congratulations, everyone, for hanging on to the very end here. Now, this last module looks at communication, which is the key objective of most companies using TNFD. So while it's the last, it's certainly not the least important. So let's dive into it. So in Communicate, we will focus on 2 key aspects: the importance of engaging, particularly looking at engagement with Indigenous people and local communities, but even beyond that, in order to assess and report on nature. And secondly, how to include nature-related information in your reporting to investors. So let's start at exploring engagement broadly, and we will use this unit to also come back to our previous discussion on engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities, since that is particularly relevant when talking about nature. But before discussing who exactly a company should be engaging with, I think it's important to discuss first, what do we mean by engagement? So engagement is two-way communication with groups that the company should not just share information with in a unilateral way, but they're groups that the company can also learn from and whose insights will enhance the company's success. So to understand what groups the company should engage with, it's helpful to first step back and take a look at why different groups of stakeholders would be interested in the company's management of nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So for example, as we have discussed earlier today, Indigenous peoples and local communities have traditional knowledge and connections to nature that a company can learn from. However, information from other groups, such as the company's own workforce, its customers or its end users, the workers in its value chain, and other affected communities can also provide invaluable insight to ensuring the successful management of nature-related risks and opportunities. So it's important to take a moment to think about the reason for engaging these different stakeholder groups and what that can provide to your organization. Now, when engaging with these different stakeholder groups, it's important to also consider from the outset what expectations these stakeholders might have for your management of nature. So for example, we're seeing regulators have expectations for transparency and compliance and oversight. Policymakers are really focused on the public interest and ensuring that national economies remain resilient as nature comes under pressure. Then Indigenous peoples are emphasizing cultural preservation rights and the protection of territories that are often biodiversity rich. Civil society organizations are pushing for stronger action on environmental and social issues. Investors want to understand how nature risk could affect returns, creditworthiness, long-term value, and there are many others from customers and suppliers to local communities, which you saw in the previous slide. Now, we did just focus mostly on why different stakeholder groups might want more information from companies on how they are managing their nature-related risks and opportunities. But what is equally important is why a company might want to engage with those stakeholders. And as I mentioned at the start of this unit, engagement is about two-way communication. And by engaging these various stakeholders, companies also see a lot of benefits from that. So we highlighted some of the key benefits identified on this slide, but of course, this list is not exhaustive. Some of the examples of benefits we might see is meeting standards and reporting requirements. So for example, demonstrating meaningful engagement and effective processes to consider the views of relevant stakeholder groups in a company's processes is actually a requirement of various reporting standards and jurisdictional requirements. Also learning from key stakeholder groups to help manage issues, either from learning about how others are solving similar problems or learning about the expectations of these stakeholder groups to ensure our collaborative success, and collaboration. So as we've discussed previously, inclusive, respectful, and open collaboration with Indigenous peoples and local communities in order to identify shared approaches is a clear benefit of engagement. And also creating engagement creates important opportunities that contribute to the restoration and protection of nature and benefit these groups. At the same time, however, failure to meaningfully engage can also lead to significant risks and loss of these opportunities for business. So important to keep that in mind. Now, before we move on, I do want to just take a little moment here to come back to the topic of engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities in particular. We have discussed this a few times today, and I think it has become quite clear that this is a unique form of engagement that companies are often not as familiar with if they're not already working on the management of nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. As a reminder, Indigenous peoples and local communities play a uniquely important role in nature-related disclosure because their lands host the majority of the world's remaining biodiversity. Also, their traditional knowledge and stewardship practices are proven to slow or reverse nature loss. As we have already discussed today, this means that communication with these groups should not just be one way. There needs to be a true engagement or two-way communication to really ensure the successful management of nature-related risks and opportunities. So the TNFD emphasizes that engaging Indigenous peoples and local communities is not only a matter of respecting internationally recognized rights, such as free, prior, and informed consent, but also essential for identifying and managing nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And meaningful, respectful, and ongoing dialogue with these groups ensures that companies' assessments and disclosures are grounded in local realities, incorporate diverse knowledge systems, and help avoid social and reputational risks. So this makes Indigenous peoples and local communities and engagement with them central to credible and decision useful nature disclosures. Now, as a reminder, because of the important role that these groups should play in successful management of nature-related risks and opportunities, TNFD has produced guidance to support meaningful engagement by companies and financial institutions with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and other stakeholders for the assessment, management, and disclosure of nature-related issues. Just to point out, this guidance was established or built on established international standards and frameworks, so particularly the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I flag this because, as you will see in the second point on this slide, engagement with these groups is often not standard practice and is poorly executed. However, in many cases, there are very clear human rights obligations that need to be followed. So I therefore highly recommend making use of this guide and therefore designing engagement activities to first, or when you're designing them, to first read this publication. Now, that brings us to the second and last part of this module in our training, which is the investor perspective. But to kick us off, I'm going to come back to Patrick at Swire Properties.
Our foremost advice is to begin immediately and embrace iterations. Don't let perfection be the hurdle for progression. Do not wait for perfect data or methodologies. The framework is designed for progressive application. You can start by convening a cross-functional team, including risk, finance, procurement, and sustainability. Team can run a high-level LEAP assessment on a single pilot asset or a specific business unit. And this initial qualitative exercise will quickly help you to review your most material issues, and then use these findings to engage the leadership by framing the discussion in terms of strategic risk and opportunity, such as supply chain stability or physical climate resilience. And secondly, you may also leverage your existing foundations. For example, your TCFD reporting, ESG data, and environmental management system. They are basically the very important foundations. And TNFD isn't about starting from scratch. It's about expanding your current risk management lens and building on your climate scenarios by incorporating nature-related variables like water stress. And this pragmatic stepwise approach makes your tasks more manageable, demonstrate early progress, and build crucial momentum for deeper integration.
Right. So with that, let's look at getting started whilst regulation is evolving. We've had a lot of questions about that in the Q&A. So let's look at what this means in practice. So one key message is that you don't need to wait for mandatory requirements. Even if you're not currently required to disclose nature-related information, every organization should begin assessing its nature-related issues. Doing this early strengthens organizational resilience, it improves strategic decision-making, and it helps companies anticipate risks and opportunities across their value chain. Now, at the same time, we're actually seeing very clear signals that nature-related reporting will become part of mainstream standards. A major milestone was the IFRS Foundation's announcement that the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, will begin a standard-setting process on nature, building directly on the TNFD recommendation. Just to clarify, this does not mean that there will be necessarily an S3 standard, not that they've said they've ruled that out, but it does not. It does mean that the TNFD and nature in particular is expected to increasingly be integrated into disclosure standards and requirements based on these standards. So the key takeaway is that starting now really puts organizations in a far stronger position, and the TNFD framework already aligns with major reporting systems and early assessment work. So it's a really good place to start. Now, also noting the LEAP tool builds the capacity and the capability of companies that will need this when standards do evolve. So nature-related reporting really is increasingly vital, and companies are already making disclosures. So it's time to just keep moving forward. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good, as Patrick said. Great. So now that we've explored why nature-related information matters to investors, let's spend just a few minutes on how to communicate this information effectively to investors. To help with this, the SSE in its model guidance has developed a nature disclosure checklist. It's an Annex 1 of the guidance, so you can access that on our webpage. And when preparing nature-related disclosures, there's several important principles to keep in mind. We're going to go through each of these in turn, so I'll just dive straight into that. So the first one is to make sure that you're speaking the language of investors. So as we've discussed, it's important that your disclosures use the right information and the right language to speak effectively to an investor audience. So to illustrate what this looks like in practice, here's an example from Tulare Bioindustries 2023 TCFD and TNFD report, so climate and nature together. Tulare Bioindustry is a Nordic private asset manager specializing in private equity funds that invest in industrial scale facilities and technologies in the bio economy and circular economy. This also answers a few questions we've had about financial sector examples. So in this example, they provide a very clear summary of several nature-related risks and opportunities that they have identified. And importantly, they also disclose the potential financial impacts associated with each of them. One example they highlight is the increased risk of forest fires. They explain that forest fires can reduce the availability of key raw materials, drive up prices, and affect the profitability of certain assets. This is a good demonstration of how physical environmental risks then convert into financial effects in a way investors can immediately understand. It also speaks directly to the key principle in the SSE Nature Disclosure Checklist that companies should clearly link their DIROs to their enterprise risks. Maybe some other strengths of this example include pairing narrative explanations with quantitative ranges, drawing on recommended TNFD metrics and showing how nature-related issues connect to the organization's broader resilience and strategy. So these elements help investors assess both risk exposure and management quality. Great. So another consideration when communicating, oops, sorry, I went too far. Yeah, right there. When communicating to investors is that nature-related information should be integrated into climate and broader ESG narratives to show the interlinkages between these dimensions. I saw a few questions in the Q&A about whether the TNFD can be used to just write a standalone TNFD report, which of course it can be used that way, but keep in mind the importance of integration, and that's what this slide is showing here. So an important part of integrating nature into corporate reporting is making disclosures streamlined and concise across different standards so that users can very easily navigate that information. To help us explore how this could work, let's look at another example here from Ørsted, a Danish multinational energy company that has really transformed from a fossil fuel intensive utility, formerly Dong Energy, into the world's largest developer of offshore wind power. Here, Ørsted provides a really useful example. They use a correspondence table in their annual report to show how their disclosures align with the TNFD recommended disclosures and where each item appears in the report. So in case you can't read this clearly, I understand it's a little bit small on your screen. The table has the main themes or the 4 core content areas of the TNFD recommended disclosures on the left, and then the report is, which report you can find this information in, the section of the report, and the page that you can find this. And this approach really embeds nature-related information directly alongside other ESG governance and strategy content, rather than treating it as a separate add-on. And this kind of mapping helps report users quickly locate relevant information across multiple frameworks. Also to note that the TNFD's engagement with market participants has actually shown growing demand for these correspondence and cross-reference tables, especially to navigate the ISSB, ESRS, TNFD, GRI, and even product certification standards. Great. So another important point when communicating with investors is understanding the legal and regulatory context you operate in. So in other words, you need to know the rules of the game in your jurisdiction, and those rules are evolving quickly. So a practical step companies can take now is to map their disclosures to whichever requirements apply to them, which helps both regulators and investors understand your alignment. Even if you're not yet required to disclose nature-related information, every organization should still be assessing its nature-related issues. Nature loss can affect any business model, so understanding your dependencies, your impacts, and then the risks and opportunities is simply good business practice. And even without nature-specific rules, many jurisdictions already require disclosure of financially material issues. So if your internal assessment identifies something that could affect your performance or your license to operate, such as a water dependency or biodiversity impact, for example, investors probably need to know about this. So the key takeaway on this slide is this: understand your jurisdiction, map your disclosures, and assess your nature-related issues now. It strengthens trust, it improves preparedness, and it positions you ahead of rapidly emerging reporting requirements. Now, speaking of trust, as we build on the points we've just discussed, one of the most powerful ways to earn confidence and trust of investors and stakeholders more broadly is simply to be transparent. So balanced, honest reporting goes a long way in showing that your organization understands its nature-related issues and is dealing with them responsibly. This also means being upfront about uncertainty. It's completely normal at this stage to have data gaps or areas where methods are still developing. Investors aren't expecting perfection, but they do value clarity on what's known, what's still being worked on, and where assumptions have been made. So we can see this approach clearly in this example from Ferrovial's integrated annual report. Ferrovial is a major Spanish multinational in the transport and infrastructure sector. And their report lays out the core hypotheses behind its nature-related analysis. They explain how biodiversity and ecosystems link to the resilience of their business model. They point directly to the methodologies they've used, including the integrated natural capital assessment approach. They also highlight how consultation with local communities have shaped their understanding of risks and impacts. What's especially helpful is that they openly describe the assumptions that are underpinning their analysis. And these can evolve as new information becomes available or things might change, but disclosing them now gives readers a clear sense of how they reach those conclusions. And finally, this sort of transparency should extend beyond investor reporting, right? Organizations should also make sure they report back to Indigenous peoples, local communities, and other affected stakeholders in ways that are accessible and culturally appropriate, and clearly explain how their insights have helped shape risk assessment and materiality judgments and their strategic decisions. Great. And one final example for you. So here we're going to look at how organizations can bring their nature disclosures to life using data. So numbers aren't just technical details. They can help investors see real progress and understand trends and compare performance over time. And when paired with a very clear narrative, they become incredibly powerful. So this example comes from Manulife's Natural Capital Report. Manulife is a Canadian insurance and financial services provider. They have significant timberland and also agriculture investments. And what they're showing here is essentially the carbon balance of their timberland in their portfolio, but presented in a way that's very clear, structured, and importantly, decision useful. So their calculations build on three variables. First, the starting point, the previous year's total forest carbon store. Then any resource changes, which captures shifts in acreage or updates in methodology from one year to the next. And then finally, a net biological change, which reflects the natural balance between tree growth and also harvesting. So on top of that, they track how much harvested timber ends up as solid wood, which has a very long life. So in this case, products that are assumed to store carbon for around 100 years. So each of these elements is reported separately and then combined to show annual carbon removals. And the result is a very clear picture of how Manulife is managing the nature-related dependency impacts and risks and opportunities within its timber portfolio year by year. I think what's especially effective here is the combination of a narrative that explains the logic and the risks, supported by visuals and quantitative data that shows performance and really shows what they mean in practice. So this pairing of, a clear storytelling plus robust metrics is exactly what helps investors make better informed decisions and understand well an organization and how they're managing its nature-related issues. And of course, to build that trust that we've been talking about. All right, so that's the end for me. I'm going to pass back to Fiona to wrap us up now.
Great. Thank you for that, Tiffany. I think that's a great way to round off the session, and hopefully seeing some more examples there of how different companies are approaching this is a really helpful way to conclude things and show that as well. So I'd encourage you as well to make sure you check out the TNFD's report library for more examples of different companies and how they've approached this. But just to wrap up on a few key takeaways from this segment. So engagement of Indigenous people and local communities. We, of course, heard from Tiffany there that that's key to really meaningfully assessing and managing nature-related issues. These groups are the original custodians of the land. They hold the deepest and most critical knowledge about the ecosystems that we rely on. So this isn't just a matter of fairness, it's a matter of success. If you skip this step, you risk getting your assessments and your management strategies fundamentally wrong. The second thing that we talked about here was around getting ahead of the curve. So preparing your voluntary disclosures now is going to leave you ready for tomorrow's mandatory reporting requirements. And as we've heard, that regulatory landscape is developing fast. So by starting to assess and report voluntarily today, you're already going to be stress testing your systems and refining your data collection. And so that means that when mandatory reporting obligations potentially do arrive, you're not going to be scrambling because you'll already have the robust processes and the high quality data in place that could turn that regulatory hurdle into a potential competitive advantage. And finally, we'll talk about a key audience for your disclosures, your investors. So your information needs to be balanced, transparent, and to speak their language. And Tiffany talked us through there a number of different tools and tips to think about that area. Crucially, you really need to connect your nature strategy directly to finance. So showing how nature-related risks affect your capital allocation, your liabilities, and your strategic resilience. And really by ensuring that your data is investor grade, it's rigorous, comparable, and clear, you'll successfully build that trust that you need to secure capital and demonstrate long-term stewardship. And of course, that's what the 14 TNFD recommended disclosures were really designed for, to structure your reporting. And really by using that set of recommendations, you're going to be enabling that real investor focus. Okie doke. So I think we do have time before we close out the session just to talk through quickly a few of your questions. So I think we've answered well over 150 questions in the session so far. I think there's been a lot of key themes here coming out. So maybe I'll invite my colleagues who are here. We've got Fiona, I know we've got Tiffany as well, and Corley, I know you've been answering a lot of them in the background. So if there's anything maybe that you'd summarize from what you've seen coming through in the Q&A, it'd be great for us maybe just to talk about that now. So I think just looking at a few of the open questions that we've had come through in the communicate section, maybe a few people have kind of asked questions in particular around the investor perspective and how to really connect nature into financial issues and to speak that investor language. So I think we talked through some examples that could hopefully help you with that, but maybe I could start with that question, Tiffany, if that's something you'd be happy to come in on.
Yeah, sure. I think I might take an angle of that, Fiona, that we often talk about also in our IFRS training, in the sense of if you're not providing this information, investors have to guess. So the assumption is if you're not sharing how you are managing these risks and prioritizing them, it means you're not managing and prioritizing them, which makes you a more risky investment for the investors that are evaluating you then. So I think sometimes it's not necessarily getting a perfect disclosure that's the objective, but rather starting that and starting to provide the information you can so that investors understand the journey you're on and the journey you're starting on, so that they understand you're not ignoring this completely, that it's not a discussion that's never been looked at internally. So I think that's maybe the most important starting point. Then, of course, we saw from S&P that there's, much more sophistication that goes into this from investor side of it. But getting started is really the first point that really will help you be evaluated as you should be.
Thanks, Tiffany. I think that's really good advice. And Fiona, I see you're on camera as well. Is there anything that you'd add on that point, or any other points that have been coming up through the Q&A?
So I might just move to a different question just because I was busy answering, but I see that there was a question in terms of best practice for financial institutions. So just to clarify that the TNFD has a guidance for financial institutions. If we haven't already shared in the chat, we can definitely do that. And just in terms of best practice, should you include all of your clients? It's really about prioritizing your most clients with the most significant nature-related issues. And so as for corporates, we really encourage just prioritization where it's relevant in terms of both the kind of nature-related issues they would present.
Great, thanks, Fiona. I think that's really good to highlight. I think I shared that in the Q&A in response to one person, but I've just sent that link again in the chat. Just to highlight as well for everyone, actually, we do recognize, of course, that the finance perspective is a little bit nuanced and different in a few places here. So we are developing an adaptation of this training program at the moment, particularly targeting the bank sector, because we know, of course, banks are often listed on exchanges as well. So we'll be holding some global sessions of that bank-specific training towards the end of the year. So be sure to keep an eye on our website for the dates of those sessions. And if that's relevant for you or any of your colleagues, please do join us for that session as well, where we'll go into a bit more on that perspective. Brilliant. So I see we've still got lots of questions coming through. So thanks everyone for sharing these. I think my colleagues will do their best to keep answering those in the background. But I think in the interest of time, we'll move in to the final segments, because I know there's probably a few things we're all eager to hear about as we round off the session. Of course, the certificates, I know, being one of those. So just to recap really on our goals for today. So if you remember, we talked about these 4 areas that we started off with, really about the why, what, how, and who of nature. So we do hope that you've left you here with a good range of tools and resources that can help you to develop your understanding on these areas, and that you're feeling more familiar with those. Of course, we know that even though we've had a long time together online today, there's a lot to unpack here. And so I think the most important thing we'd like you to take away is knowing that there is a lot of guidance available to you there, and having a bit of a better understanding of how to navigate all of that content and find what's right for the particular topic you want to understand. But let's just recap and see really how you're feeling at the end of the session. Now we're coming to a close. So we asked you this question at the start, if you remember back 3.5 hours ago. How well do you think you understand now the link between nature and business? Hopefully we've helped you to move forward on that a little bit in this time together. But let's just take a moment and see what you think about that. So thanks everyone who's voting at the moment. I'm seeing a lot of people indicating somewhere above 7 on the scale. I think we were averaging somewhere between sort of 6 and 8, or 5 and 8 to start with. So I think that's great to see maybe a general uptick in the average response there. I'll end that and just share the results with you so you can have a quick look. But great to see, I think, an increase on the average front there. So great that a lot of you are feeling a little bit more comfortable on this. Thanks for sharing. And then I think just to wrap things up, we'll go back to Menti for one last time. A quick question, which I know some of you have already been answering as you've spotted the question available to you there. just to get you to reflect really on your key takeaway from the training. Maybe you'd like to share with us one key thing you've learned today that maybe you didn't know before you started, maybe one realization about a different perspective on something, or maybe you've got an action point, something that you want to take away today to put into practice or to discuss with your colleagues. So I think it's maybe helpful just to have that one reflection as we leave today. We've talked about a lot of different things to make sure we've all got one thing to take away. So I'll just have a look at a few of your responses here. Nature disclosure isn't easy. The training, yeah, very complicated. So maybe just a better understanding of the complexities of this topic. I think we never said it would be easy, but of course, I think understanding that complexity and moving forward from it is the key. So I hope, in particular, maybe the LEAP approach is a good practical way to move forward on that, because it really is designed, as we said, to be iterative. So you don't need to necessarily bring in all that complexity from day one, but use that structure to start your thinking. A few people are mentioning LEAP indeed as the best takeaway for something that they want to do, and maybe to start disclosing sooner rather than later, and maybe not waiting for the mandatory regulations. I think that's a very good point to highlight as well. Those are very soon coming down the track, but what is very clear is, as you say, that the TNFD is going to form a strong basis of that. So voluntarily using that guidance now is going to be a great way to get yourself prepared for mandatory requirements. Great. So managing reporting on nature is not just an environmental responsibility, but a strategic necessity and ensuring resilience. I think that's a great way to sum things up. And applying the TNFD's pillars builds on that IFRS approach. And so it's not necessarily about duplication here or something completely different, but really building on that baseline. So I think that's a very good takeaway indeed. So great. Thanks everyone for sharing those thoughts. I think it's nice for everyone as well to see the different takeaways coming through from each of you. I think there's a lot of commonality here about how we're thinking about this, but really encourage you to take forward that thinking as you leave our session today, and to plan on your next steps internally. Let's go back to our final few slides in the presentation then, as we wrap things up. Okay. So a few things just to talk about in follow-up is just to give you a few key resources. We're coming towards the end of the session. We know there's a lot to move forward on. So I just want to show you a few key things that you can use to help you as you move forward. So firstly, just a quick reminder that we've developed the SSE suite of materials on this, closely working with the TNFD and our other partners. So be sure to check out our SSE model guidance on nature, the nature disclosures checklist at the back of that document that Tiffany talked us through on the investor reporting side, and of course the slide presentation for today's session, for the preparatory video, and the recordings of both of those are available on that event page, which we shared with you throughout the session today. From the TNFD side, we've shared a lot of valuable resources from TNFD today, but a final point to highlight is the main materials geared towards capacity building, which the TNFD have developed. So they have a trainer portal and learning lab, which includes free to access learning modules and resources that you can either use to further your own learning or perhaps to brief your colleagues on this topic as well. We'd also encourage you to take a look at the example reports and the case study library, which you can access via the TNFD Knowledge Hub for more context and inspiration on this topic. From the S&P perspective, there is a link available in the slide presentation here that you'll find at the back if you'd like to look at S&P's materials or to request a follow-up directly from the team from what they've talked to you about today. And then just to show you that these exist in the back of the handout, for each module, we've got a summary slide which lists all of the key resources for each section that we shared with you in the chat and that we talked through. So I won't walk through all of these, but just to show you that these are existing in the slide presentation for each of the training modules for you to have a look at as well. And so one very important point to talk about before we all go is your completion certificate. So a big thank you for all of you who stuck with us throughout this full 3.5 hour training. We're really appreciative of all the time and engagement you've put into today's session and your really thoughtful questions as well. So as a merit for your hard work, you're now able to receive your certificate of completion for the course. So to get your certificate, what you'll need to do is to fill out the feedback survey. Tiffany has shared the link to that in the chat. Maybe we'll post it a couple of times, thanks Tiffany, to make sure you can see that link. If you follow that link and fill out the feedback survey, of course, we'd love to know what you think of the training and any improvements as well. But what we'll do is if you put your name and email address into the feedback survey, we send out the certificates to everyone who takes part in that survey. We send out the certificates on a weekly basis, so please give us up to a week to receive your certificate. Make sure to check your spam folders as well if you are missing your certificate in case the certificate's gone to your junk folder. We'll also send that link out to you again in 24 hours time in an email that you'll receive from Zoom after today's session. So make sure to check out that email as well if you miss it in the chat, but that link is right there for you now as well. As we're closing out the session, just a few final words and thank yous to close us out. Firstly, just a big thank you to all of the SSE supporters. So this is a group of stock exchanges and other organisations who are committed to promoting sustainable capital markets, helping to make these training sessions possible. So if you are an organisation who might be interested to become a supporter, please do reach out to the SSE. You can find our contact details on our website. If you're an exchange as well, just to note that supporters receive priority access to all of our training programmes as well. So that might be of interest to you. So please follow up with us if you'd like to know more about that. And finally, just to close out with a few thank yous, firstly to our partners at particularly the TNFD. So a big thank you to Fiona for joining us today and for all of your time to share lots of insights with our attendees and respond rapidly. I'm sure your fingers might be quite tired now from typing all those Q&A responses. So a big thank you. A thank you as well to Valentina and Yusuf from the S&P team for joining us as well and for their presentations. And of course, to my colleagues, Tiffany and Corley for, again, doing lots of work in the background, as well as presenting to answer your questions. Lastly, but not least, of course, a big thanks to our donors and supporters at the UNDP and ICCY. And of course, a big thank you to all of you who've joined us here today with us in the session. We'll hope to see you at a future SSE workshop. As a quick reminder, again, if you have any colleagues you think could benefit from joining this training, we're running a second global workshop on the 9th of September. That session will be in the afternoon for sort of European and America's time zones, morning time for them, but later in the day. So you can find that on the SSE webpage if you'd like to share that with any colleagues. So wishing you a great rest of the day, everyone, and thanks again for joining us.